Tonight we are going somewhere most people have never really stood still long enough to think about. In the span of a single lifetime, a man born with nothing, no land, no treasury, no army, no name, that anyone outside his small corner of the world would have recognized, built the largest, contiguous land empire in all of recorded human history. The Mongol Empire, at its peak, covered nearly a quarter of the Earth's entire land surface. That is not legend, that is just what happened. And tonight, we are going to figure out how. Welcome to Legacy of Throne. Drop your current city or country in the comments right now, along with your local time. Whether you are watching from Kabul or Kandahar, from London or Toronto, from Washington or Warsaw, tell us you are here. We read every single comment, and genuinely love knowing how far the Legacy of Throne community reaches. Subscribe if you haven't already, hit that notification bell, and let this extraordinary journey begin. Tonight we are heading to the eastern steppes of Central Asia, roughly 800 years ago, to a land of endless grass, bitter wind, and a people who lived entirely on the move. Let the story begin. Before there was an empire, there was just grass, not the cultivated, tidy kind that grows in gardens or along country roads, but an ocean of it, stretching from the great forests of Siberia in the north all the way down toward the deserts of Central Asia in the south, and from the mountain edges of Manchuria in the east to the fringes of the Islamic world in the west. The Mongolian plateau sits at the beating heart of this territory, perched roughly a mile above sea level on average, wide open to winds that sweep across hundreds of miles of flat land with nothing at all to interrupt them. In summer, the steppe could bake under a sun that left the ground cracked and pale. In winter, temperatures dropped so severely that livestock froze where they stood overnight, and a family that lost its animals had nothing left to sustain itself through to spring. This was the land that shaped the Mongols, generation after generation, long before anyone outside the steppe had reason to pay them much attention. For thousands of years, the people of this plateau had organized their lives around movement. They kept horses, cattle, sheep, and goats. They migrated with the seasons north in summer to follow the fresh pasture, south in winter to find shelter from the worst of the cold. They slept in round, portable felt structures called gurs, which could be taken apart or reassembled in under an hour. Everything a family owned had to be transportable, because staying in one place too long meant exhausting the land beneath your feet, and an exhausted pasture meant a dying herd, and a dying herd meant a family that would not survive the next winter. Mobility was not a lifestyle choice on the Mongolian steppe. It was simply the price of staying alive. This kind of existence demanded a very particular kind of person. Children learned to ride horses before they had properly mastered walking on flat ground. Boys were given small bows almost as soon as they were strong enough to pull one. By the time a Mongol man reached adulthood, he had already spent more hours in the saddle than most professional soldiers anywhere else in the world spent in a lifetime of training. And he could place an arrow into a moving target from the back of a galloping horse with a consistency that would have baffled trained military archers from China, Persia, or Europe. The steppe, in its brutal and patient way, had spent centuries producing exactly this kind of human being. But for all their toughness and skill, the Mongol peoples of the 12th century were deeply, stubbornly divided among themselves. The plateau was shared and fought over by dozens of competing clans and tribal confederacies: the Mongols, the Tatars, the Merkits, the Naimans, the Keraites, the Oats. These were not just neighboring groups. They were rivals who raided each other's herds, kidnapped each other's women, and settled long-running blood feuds across generations. There was no single ruler of the steppe. There had never been one in living memory. The very idea of a unified authority commanding all these competing tribes would have struck most people living on the Mongolian plateau in the 1100s as not just unlikely, but completely absurd. What held these societies together was not government or geography, but the clan. A man's deepest loyalty was to his bloodkin first, then to the wider tribe he belonged to, and then sometimes to a powerful leader he had personally chosen to follow. But even that last loyalty was conditional. If a leader died or showed weakness, his followers often dissolved and regrouped around someone stronger. Power on the steppe was personal. It lived in the man who held it, and in the web of relationships he managed to maintain. The moment that web frayed, the power went with it. Religion on the Mongolian plateau was mostly shamanic in character. The central belief was in Toghrul, the eternal blue sky, a supreme heavenly force that governed the cosmos and bestowed fortune or misfortune upon men below. Shamans known as Bör served as go-betweens for the living and the spirit world, performing ceremonies to bring rain, advise on battle, or intercede in matters of sickness and death. Alongside this core belief sat a striking openness to other faiths. Taurian Christianity had already worked its way into some of the steppe tribes, particularly the powerful Keraites. Buddhism filtered in gradually from Tibet and from China to the south. Islam was present along the western and southern edges of the steppe world. The Mongols held all of this with surprising ease, absorbing outside spiritual ideas without much anxiety or conflict, a flexibility that would later prove one of their most effective tools as an empire. To the south of the Mongolian plateau lay the most populous civilization on Earth at the time, but it was not a unified one. The northern half of what we now call China was controlled by the Jin Dynasty, a state established by the Gurchin people, who had swept down from Manchuria in the early 1100s and forced the ethnic Chinese Han ruling class southward. The southern Song dynasty held the regions below the High River, an entirely separate political entity. Between the Mongolian tribes and the Jin dynasty sat the Tangut kingdom of Xia, occupying the northwestern corridor. These were agricultural, literate, densely populated societies, sitting on enormous accumulated wealth, and they looked at the nomads to their north with a mixture of mild contempt and genuine unease. For generations, the Jin dynasty and its predecessors had managed the northern steppe tribes through a classic playbook, a combination of trade privileges, occasional gifts of silk and grain, and the deliberate encouragement of intertribal rivalry. Keep the tribes fighting each other, and they would never have the time or unity to threaten China proper. It was a sensible policy, and it worked well enough for a very long time. The Jin in particular used the Tatars as a counterweight against the Mongols, quietly supplying them with resources to keep the northern frontier turbulent and divided. It is worth noting that this strategy, funding one group of people to harass another group of people you are also slightly afraid of, has a long and not especially proud history in international relations. And the Jin were hardly the last to try it. What the planners in the Jin court perhaps did not fully weigh was that every cycle of raiding, every generation of blood feud, every breakdown and rebuilding of steppe alliance was also an education. The men who survived and rose on the Mongolian plateau were not simply fighters. They were strategists, negotiators, and managers of small but ferociously competitive political systems. They understood how coalitions formed and how they collapsed. They understood timing, patience, and the value of a betrayal well placed. These were people who had spent their entire lives operating in conditions of near total uncertainty with extremely high personal stakes. The steppe produced hard men, but it also produced thoughtful ones. Somewhere in the middle of the 12th century, historians generally place it around 162. Though the exact year is still a matter of quiet academic debate, a boy was born into the Borgjigan clan of the Mongol tribe. His father was a minor chieftain named Yesügei. His mother was named Holan, who had herself been seized from a Merket tribesman on her wedding journey, an event that was by steppe standards not unusual enough to mark in any particular way. The boy was born, according to the stories told about him later, gripping a dark clot of blood in his right hand. The people around him took this as a sign of something, though they could not have said what. They named him Tojane, after a Tatar chieftain his father had recently captured in a raid. It was not by any reasonable measure a spectacular beginning. A minor clan boy, in a fractured and violent world, born into a family of modest standing, named after a captured enemy, as a kind of trophy. There was nothing in those first years, nothing at all to suggest that the grass would eventually tremble beneath the weight of the largest land empire the world had ever produced, assembled in a single lifetime by this one child, born in a felt tent on the open steppe. But history, as it so often does, had its own ideas about what came next. A boy named Temujin. Temujin's early childhood was for the first several years relatively unremarkable by the standards of the Mongolian steppe. His father, yes, was a man of some local standing, not a great Khan by any measure, but a capable raider and a recognized leader within the Börte clan, which was itself part of the broader Mongol tribal grouping. The family moved with the seasons, as all steppe families did, keeping their animals, maintaining their gear, and navigating the constant low-level politics of clan life. Temujin grew up alongside his brothers, Kasar, Kachun, and Toygug, and a younger sister named Toyun. There was also a pair of half-bros from one of Yesügei's other wives, Bega and Belguti. Households on the steppe were often structured this way, with multiple wives and children from different mothers all living and moving together under one clan's orbit. The world Temujin grew up in was not peaceful, but it had a kind of rough predictability to it. Raids happened, alliances shifted, seasons changed. A boy on the steppe learned early what mattered: the health of the herd, the loyalty of your kin, the strength of your bow arm, and the ability to read which direction the wind of power was blowing on any given day. These were not abstract lessons. They came from watching, listening, and surviving. When Temujin was around 9 years old, Yesügei made a decision that was perfectly normal within steppe customs, but would end up reshaping the entire course of his family's life. He took his eldest son on a journey to find a bride. Marriage on the Mongolian plateau typically involved finding a girl from a different clan. Marrying within your own bloodline was strongly discouraged, and ideally from a clan with useful connections or good reputation. The two of them traveled to the territory of the Onirat people, a group known, among other things, for producing particularly capable women. There, Yug encountered a man named Sexion, whose young daughter, Börte, had a face, according to the account recorded later in the secret history of the Mongols, that was bright with light and fire in her eyes. Yug was satisfied. An agreement was reached. Temujin, aged 9, was left with Secsion's family to begin the standard period of living with his future in-laws before the formal marriage could take place. This was customary. Everything about it was ordinary. Yes began the journey home alone. On his way back across the steppe, he stopped to accept hospitality from a group of Tatars, the same people who had long been rivals and occasional enemies of the Mongol Börte clan. Whether they recognized Yesügei immediately, or only realized who he was after he had already eaten and drunk with them, is not entirely clear from the historical accounts. What is clear is that by the time he left their camp and continued his journey westward, he was already sick. The Tatars had almost certainly poisoned his food or drink. This was not an uncommon method of dealing with enemies on the steppe, where a direct confrontation could be costly, and an indirect one left fewer loose ends. Yug managed to make it back close enough to his own people to send a messenger ahead, calling for a trusted man named Monglik to go fetch Temujin from the Onirat. By the time Temujin returned to his family's camp, his father was dying. Within days, Yesügei was dead. He was probably somewhere in his 30s. Temujin was 9, perhaps 10 years old. What followed was a study in how quickly steppe loyalty could evaporate. The clan, the very people who had looked to Yesügei for leadership, who had raided alongside him and shared meat at his fire, now looked at his widow and her young children and made a calculation. The children were too young to lead. Holan was a woman without a powerful male protector. Following them offered no advantage, and the steppe was not a place where loyalty survived long, without practical benefit attached to it. One by one, and then in groups, the families and followers of the Börte clan, who had gathered around Yesügei, simply packed up and left. They took their animals, they took their possessions, they followed another leader, a man named Subutai, who was also of the Börte line, but had no reason to burden himself with a dead man's difficult inheritance. Holan did not accept this quietly. She rode after the departing families, holding up the clan's standard, the tuk, a pole hung with black horsehair, trying to call them back by appealing to their sense of obligation and honor. Some of the accounts say she managed to turn a few of them around temporarily, but ultimately the departures continued, and the family was left largely alone. A widow, 5 young children, and 2 half-brothers camped beside the Onan River with no herd no allies, and no safety net of any kind. For the next several years, this family survived on almost nothing. Holan gathered wild plants, roots and berries. The older children fished in the river. Temujin and his brothers learned to hunt the small animals of the steppe marmot, rabbits, the occasional deer, with whatever they had available. They were not starving in a dramatic sense, but they were living at the absolute edge of what the steppe could offer without a functioning herd, without trade relationships, and without the protection that came from belonging to a functioning clan structure. These years did something to Temujin that is worth pausing on, because it shows up in almost everything he did later. The experience of being abandoned, of watching loyalty dissolve the moment it became inconvenient, left him with a very clear-eyed understanding of what actually held people together and what did not. Blood alone was not enough. Tradition alone was not enough. What kept people loyal was a combination of genuine personal bond, shared interest, and the belief that following a particular leader actually led somewhere worth going. He had seen the alternative up close, and it had cost his family nearly everything. There was also a harder lesson from those years beside the Onan River, one that says something uncomfortable about the kind of man Temujin was becoming. Inside the family itself, tension developed over food, always a serious matter when food is genuinely scarce, and over questions of precedence and leadership between Temujin and his older half-brother Beg. The exact details have been filtered through centuries of accounts that are not always neutral. But what happened is not disputed. Temujin and his brother Kassa hunted down Bekta and killed him. Their mother Holan was furious. She called her sons out by name, with a rage that the secret history records in considerable detail, comparing them to animals that devoured their own kind. It was a brutal act, and has troubled historians and readers of Mongol history ever since. Some have framed it as a straightforward act of desperate resource competition in a family on the edge of survival. Eliminating a rival for food and authority was in ugly terms a practical decision. Others have pointed to it as evidence of the kind of ruthless calculation that would define Temujin's later career. The understanding that a challenge to his leadership, even within his own family, could not simply be managed or tolerated, but had to be ended conclusively. He was perhaps 12 years old at the time, possibly 13. The steppe had already taught him things that most people in most parts of the world never have to learn at all. The years on the Onan River also gave Temujin something less grim, his first genuine friendship and alliance. Among the boys he spent time with was a young man named Jamukha from a nearby Jadaran clan. The two of them exchanged gifts, ankle bones, the traditional tokens of Mongolian childhood, friendship, and declared themselves and/or sworn brothers. It was a bond that the steppe took seriously, a pledge of loyalty that was meant to transcend ordinary clan obligation. Jamukha was clever, charismatic, and ambitious in his own right, and the friendship between the two boys would grow into one of the most consequential and ultimately tragic relationships in the entire story of the Mongol rise to power. But that was still ahead. For now, Temujin was a boy without a clan, without land, without animals, camped beside a river in one of the emptiest landscapes on earth, learning the kind of patience that only comes from having very little and waiting anyway. The steppe had taken his father, his safety, and nearly his future. It had not yet decided what to give him back in return. Word count 1034. Apologies, that section ran short. Let me complete it to the required length now. What kept the family from complete collapse during those years was largely Holan herself. She was, by any fair accounting, a remarkable woman, having been abducted from her first husband on her wedding journey, folded into Yesügei's household, built a life around him and their children, and then watched that life dissolve almost overnight. She managed the family's survival with a steadiness that the later Mongol records acknowledge clearly. She knew which roots and plants were edible along the riverbank. She rationed food carefully. She held the family's sense of identity together through the worst of it, which was perhaps the most difficult task of all, keeping 5 grieving, hungry, increasingly feral children from losing their sense of who they were and what they might still become. The On River Valley, where the family sheltered, was at least not a terrible place to survive on subsistence terms. The river provided fish, the surrounding land offered game, the forests nearby gave firewood, and some protection from the worst of the winter winds. They did not thrive, but they endured season after season, developing skills and a kind of collective toughness that formal training could never quite replicate. By the time Temujin reached his mid-teens, he was an experienced hunter, a capable horseman despite having access to very few horses, and a young man who had spent years thinking very carefully about what had gone wrong with his father's position, and how such a thing might be prevented from happening again. The answer he was beginning to form even then had something to do with the nature of loyalty itself, with building bonds that went deeper than the conditional clan-based ties that had dissolved so easily around his mother. He could not have articulated it yet in the terms that would shape his later policies as a ruler, but the seed of it was there, planted in those hard years beside the river, watered by everything the steppe had taken from him. He was not yet a leader, he was not yet safe, he was not yet anything that the wider world would have paused to notice. But the boy who would one day be called Genghis Khan was watching, learning, and waiting with a patience that, given everything, was itself a kind of extraordinary thing. Chains, raids, and rising. The relative quiet of the Onan River years was broken sharply when Temujin was somewhere around 14 or 15 years old. The Taichi clan, the same group that had walked away from Hoan and her children after Yesügei's death, led by a man named Subutai, had been watching the surviving family from a comfortable distance. Subutai was not a man who forgot old rivalries or left loose ends to develop at their own pace. Temujin was growing, and a growing Borogan boy with even a small reputation for toughness was the kind of thing a rival clan leader on the steppe preferred to deal with before it became a larger problem. The Taichi raided the family's camp and took Temujin prisoner. He was not killed on the steppe. Killing a captive outright was not always the preferred solution a living prisoner could be put to work, displayed as a symbol of dominance or used as a bargaining tool. Instead, Temujin was fitted with a kango, a wide wooden collar locked around the neck that prevented the wearer from feeding himself, lying down comfortably, or doing much of anything without the assistance or permission of someone else. It was a deliberately humiliating device designed to reduce a person to a state of visible helplessness. Subutai moved his captive from family to family within the Taichude group, which served both as a method of sharing the responsibility of guarding him and as a way of demonstrating his control over a Borgjugan rival. What happened next is one of the most retold stories in the early Mongol accounts, and while the details have clearly been shaped by later storytelling, the core of it appears to be genuine. During a festival gathering of the Tai Chi, when guards were somewhat relaxed and attention was scattered, Temujin managed to break free. Exactly how is described differently depending on which source you consult, but the most common version involves him using the kango itself as a weapon against a guard before slipping away into the river. He hid in the water, submerged to his nose, and stayed there long enough for the initial search to pass over him. A man from one of the Taichi families, a man named Sen Shira, spotted him hiding in the river, and chose for reasons that were either compassionate or politically calculated, or both, not to raise the alarm. Later that night, Senshi's own family helped Temujin remove the kango, hid him briefly, and eventually helped him escape back to his own people. It was the kind of small individual act of quiet loyalty that Temujin remembered and repaid years later when he had the power to do so. He was not someone who forgot help when it had been given at real personal risk. He returned to his family on the On and resumed the slow, difficult work of building from almost nothing. The escape itself added something to his reputation. The story of a young man who had slipped out of a Taichi kango was exactly the kind of tale that traveled across the steppe, but reputation alone did not feed anyone or replace the herd. What he needed next was connection, alliance, a foothold in the wider world of steppe politics. The first step in that direction was also on the surface a personal one. Temujin traveled back to the Angarat people to claim Börte, the girl his father had arranged for him years earlier. Her family had honored the agreement she had waited, and the bond held. Börte came with a significant gift, a magnificent black sable coat that her family had kept as part of the marriage arrangement. This coat would shortly prove more useful than anyone expected. Temujin brought Börte back to his family's camp, and for a brief period, things seemed to be stabilizing. But the steppe does not offer long stretches of calm to people without strong protective alliances, and disaster arrived quickly. The Merkets, the same tribe from which Yesügei had once seized Holland, had never forgotten the insult. Blood debts on the Mongolian plateau were not abstractions. They were obligations passed from father to son, and the Merkets had been waiting for an opportunity to balance the account. One morning before dawn, a large Merket raiding party swept through the camp. Temujin, warned just barely in time by a family member who heard the approaching horses, escaped into the surrounding hills. Börte did not make it out. She was taken. The loss of Börte was not simply a personal blow, though it was certainly that on the steppe. A man who could not protect his own household, commanded no respect, and attracted no followers. Recovering Börte was not just a matter of marriage, it was a matter of political survival, and recovering her on his own, with no herd, no warriors, and no clan behind him, was not remotely possible. What Temujin did next demonstrated for the first time clearly how his mind worked in political terms. He went looking for powerful friends. His father, Ögedei, had years earlier maintained a bond of sworn brotherhood with Toghrul, the Kern of the Keraite people, one of the largest and most powerful tribal confederacies on the Dug steppe based around the upper Toghrul River. This old connection gave Temujin a legitimate reason to approach Toghrul directly, and he did. He presented the black sable coat, the gift Börte family had given, as a formal offering to Toghrul, and he asked for help in recovering his wife. Toghrul accepted both the gift and the appeal. He pledged warriors. Temujin also reached out to Jamukha, his childhood, under the sworn brother from the years beside. The Onan. Jamukha had grown into exactly the kind of person his early promise had suggested, a capable and charismatic leader who had built a reasonable following of his own. He agreed to ride with Temujin as well. The combined force hit the Merket camps in a swift, well-coordinated night raid. The Merket scattered. Börte was recovered, frightened, but alive, and reunited with Temujin in the immediate aftermath. The campaign was not especially large by the standards of what would come later. It was a tribal recovery raid, not a conquest, but it mattered enormously for what it demonstrated. Temujin had identified the right allies, made the right appeals, offered the right gifts, and organized the right action. He had gotten his wife back when getting her back had seemed nearly impossible. That kind of outcome on the steppe meant something. Börte was, by the time she was recovered, visibly pregnant. The child she carried, a boy who had been named Joki, had been conceived during the weeks she spent among the Merketses. Temujin acknowledged Joy as his son, without public ambiguity, and Joy was raised alongside his other children. But the question of Joy's paternity floated quietly through Mongol court politics for the rest of his life, eventually playing a significant role in the fractures of the later empire. Temujin never addressed the matter directly, which was itself a statement. On the steppe, what a powerful man chose not to say carried as much weight as what he said plainly. After the Merket campaign, Temujin and Jamukha spent roughly a year and a half traveling and living together, a period that the Mongol accounts describe in terms that suggest a genuinely close friendship between two equally ambitious men. They shared a tent. They exchanged further gifts. They talked about leadership and the nature of loyalty and the way power worked on the steppe. By any account, Jamukha was Temujin's intellectual equal and possibly his superior as a natural politician in the older clan-based model. He understood the steppes, traditional rules deeply, and played by them with real skill. But the two men were not actually the same, and the differences between them, which might have seemed minor during the warm months of shared travel, began to matter more as they each gathered followers. Jamukha's style of leadership followed the traditional steppe pattern: strong men at the top, weaker clients below, the hierarchy maintained through the social categories that clan and lineage had always defined. Temujin was doing something different, almost without announcing it. He was drawing followers based on personal loyalty to him directly, rewarding capable men regardless of their birth, keeping his word to those who kept it to him, and positioning himself not as the best man in the old system, but as an alternative to the old system altogether. The split between them, when it came, was quiet rather than sudden. After a night camp where Jamukha made a casual remark about where different groups in their traveling party should pitch their tents, a remark Börte interpreted as a subtle signal of diminishing respect toward Temujin. The two parted ways, no confrontation, no declared breach. Temujin simply began riding a different direction, and some of the people traveling with them chose to follow him rather than Jamukha. Some of those who followed included people who had not previously been committed to either man, warriors and families who were watching carefully and had decided after months of observation that Temujin was the one worth betting on. Each new follower made him slightly more credible to the next potential follower. Each gift he distributed, each promise he kept, each fair decision he made in a dispute added, quietly, to the growing sense that something new was taking shape on the steppe. He was still far from powerful, but the long climb had genuinely begun. The birth of Genghis Khan, the decade and a half that followed the split from Jamukha, was not a smooth, unbroken rise. It was a grinding stop-and-start process of campaign, alliance, setback, and recovery. The kind of political work that tends to get compressed in the retelling, but actually consumed years of effort and real danger at almost every turn. Temujin was building something without a reliable template for what he was building, and the steppe pushed back consistently. His early following was small, but unusually cohesive. The men who attached themselves to him in those first years tended to stay, which was itself notable in a world where switching loyalties was entirely normal and barely remarked upon. Part of this had to do with how he treated those who served him. Captured enemies who submitted and swore loyalty were folded into his ranks, rather than enslaved or killed. Skilled men were given positions that reflected their ability, rather than their birth clan. Defeated rivals who offered genuine submission were more often than not spared, and incorporated. This last point was genuinely unusual on the Mongolian steppe, where the traditional response to a defeated enemy was something considerably less generous, and word of it spread. His first major organized military actions in this period were against the Jurkim clan, a Borgugan subgroup that had failed to show up as promised during an earlier campaign against Mies, Tatars, an offense that Temujin treated as a fundamental breach of the loyalty compact he was attempting to establish as a non-negotiable standard. He defeated them, killed their leaders, and absorbed their people. Then he turned toward the Tatars themselves, the tribe responsible all those years earlier for poisoning his father Yassa. The campaign against the Tatars was fought in alliance with the Jin Dynasty and with Toghrul of the Keraites, and it was successful. Afterward, Temujin made a decision that illustrated both his ruthlessness and his system of thinking. He ordered the execution of every Tatar man taller than a wagon wheel. Children below that height were spared and distributed among Mongol families to be raised as Mongols. The logic was straightforward. Adults had identity resentment and the capacity for organized revenge. Children could be remade. It was a cold calculation, and he made it without apparent hesitation. Around 1190, a significant military confrontation with Jamukha took place at a location called Dalon Baljut. The two former sworn brothers faced each other with their respective followings for the first time as genuine opponents. Jamukha won the battle, and he did something afterward that damaged his reputation considerably among the broader steppe population. He boiled captured officers alive in large cooking pots. By the harsh standards of steppe warfare, this was seen as excessive, even cruel, in a way that went beyond acceptable military violence. Temujin, by contrast, had been developing a reputation for more measured treatment of defeated enemies. The contrast was not lost on the people watching from the edges. Over the following years, Temujin continued absorbing tribes, the Tatars more fully, elements of the Murkets, again, smaller clans that read the direction of things, and chose to join rather than resist. His relationship with Toghrul deepened and then inevitably cracked. Toghrul was a useful ally, but an anxious one, increasingly aware that the younger man he had helped was now the dominant force on the eastern steppe. Toghrul's son, Sangum, pushed his father toward a confrontation, arguing accurately that if Temujin continued growing unchecked, the Keraites position would eventually become untenable. A plot to ambush Temujin at a staged wedding feast was leaked, and Temujin escaped it barely in time. What followed was a hard military campaign in which Temujin initially suffered serious defeats, including one engagement where he was struck in the neck by an arrow and spent the night on the field, while a loyal companion named Jelme sucked blood from the wound to keep him from choking. He recovered. Togha, after a series of reversals, was eventually driven off and killed by the Naimans, which solved one problem and created another. The Naimans were the last major independent power on the steppe, a large, relatively sophisticated tribal confederacy in the western regions of Mongolia, whose ruler Tian Khan had become something of a collecting point for every rival and refugee that Temujin's expansion had displaced. Jamukha was there, remnants of the Merkets were there, Keraite survivors were there. It was in rough terms a coalition of everyone who had reason to want Temujin stopped, gathered under one leadership and given the chance to settle the matter decisively. The campaign against the Naimans fought around 124 was the largest military operation Temujin had conducted to that point. He moved with an organized, disciplined force that used coordinated night marches to create the appearance of a much larger army through the spread of its campfires. Tian Khan, watching from higher ground and seeing what looked like an enormous advancing force, hesitated at exactly the wrong moment. His son Kushlug urged immediate attack. Tian Khan pulled back instead. The resulting battle went badly for the Nims. Tian Khan died in the fighting. Kushluga escaped. Jamukha, who had been with the Nims, slipped away again into the western steppe. The capture of Jamukha followed not long after, though it did not come through direct pursuit. His own men, understanding which way things were moving, seized him and brought him in, hoping, presumably, that delivering the famous fugitive would earn them a good reception. Temujin had those men executed immediately for betraying their own leader. The loyalty compact he had built his following on worked in every direction, and he was not interested in setting a precedent that rewarded men who sold out the person they had sworn to serve. It was a signal as much as a punishment. Then he sat down with Jamukha. What passed between them in those final hours is not reliably recorded. What is recorded is that Jamukha refused an offer of renewed brotherhood and asked instead for a clean death, specifically one that did not involve the spilling of blood, which on the steppe carried spiritual significance. Temujin granted this. Jamukha was killed without bloodshed, likely by breaking his back, and was buried with the honors appropriate to a leader of his standing. It was, as endings between rivals go, unexpectedly dignified. The two men had been sworn brothers, then competitors, then enemies, and Temujin seems to have handled the final meeting with something more complicated than simple triumph. By the spring of 112-6, the Mongolian plateau was unified under a single authority for the first time in its recorded history. Every major tribe had been defeated, incorporated, or driven from the steppe. Temujin called a great assembly, a Kurultai, on the banks of the Onon River, the same river where he had spent those cold, hungry years hiding in the water and hunting marmots to keep his family alive. The symbolism of the location was almost certainly not accidental. At that gathering before an assembly of his followers and the leaders of every incorporated tribe, Temujin was formally declared the supreme ruler of all the Mongol peoples. The title bestowed upon him was Genghis Khan. The precise meaning of the title has been debated by scholars for several centuries. The most widely accepted interpretation is something close to universal ruler, or ruler of the ocean. With the ocean being understood as a metaphor for the totality of the world, it is worth noting as a minor historical footnote that a group of academics spent a very long time arguing about the meaning of a word that the man who received it then spent the rest of his life making self-explanatory. The Kurultai was also the occasion for a series of foundational decisions about how the new Mongol nation would be organized. A legal code known as the Great Yassa was developed, a set of laws covering everything from military conduct to the treatment of conquered peoples to basic standards of behavior within the community. The Yassa would be refined over time, but its core principles established from the beginning that the new Mongol state was not simply a larger version of the old tribal system. It was something genuinely different. The army was reorganized along decimal lines. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors, each with a designated commander. Soldiers were assigned to units without regard to their original clan or tribe, which effectively broke the old social glue of tribal loyalty and replaced it with loyalty to the Ronit, to the commander, and ultimately to Genghis Khan himself. A man who had been a Merket, a Tatar, or a Keraite was now simply a Mongol soldier in a unit of 1,000, and his standing within that unit depended on what he could do, rather than where he had come from. Key commanders were elevated to positions of permanent authority. Men like Subutai, Jebe, Mukali, and Joy were given commands that reflected their demonstrated ability. These were not noblemen in any inherited sense. Subutai, who would go on to become arguably the most accomplished battlefield commander in Mongol history, had been born a blacksmith's son on the steppe that was before 166. That background would have capped his prospects fairly firmly. Under the new arrangement, it meant almost nothing. What Genghis Khan had created on the banks of the Onan River was not just an empire in the early 4 stages of expansion. It was a functioning state with a legal code, a professional military, and a structure of governance that drew on talent wherever it found it. The world to the south, east, and west had no idea what had just been assembled on the steppe above them. They were about to find out. The war machine. To understand what the Mongol army actually was, it helps to set aside the image that tends to come to mind. A horde of screaming riders pouring across the landscape in a disorganized mass of horses and noise. That picture, which has been repeated in illustrations and films for centuries, is almost entirely wrong. The Mongol military was one of the most disciplined, precisely coordinated, and strategically sophisticated fighting forces that the medieval world ever produced. It did not succeed because it was large. It succeeded because it was better organized, better led, and better adapted to the conditions of its campaigns than almost anything it encountered. The foundation of the entire system was the horse archer. Every Mongol soldier was a cavalryman, and every Mongol cavalryman had grown up on horseback from early childhood. This was not training in the conventional sense. It was something more deeply embedded than that. The relationship between a Mongol rider and his horse was a lifetime of accumulated instinct. A soldier could eat in the saddle, sleep briefly in the saddle, and shoot accurately from the saddle at full gallop, releasing the arrow at the precise moment between strides when the horse's hooves were all off the ground and the body was momentarily stable. This technique, known sometimes as the Pantheon shot when done in retreat, was practiced until it became reflex rather than thought. The weapon that made all of this lethal was the Mongol composite bow. It was a short bow, by the standards of the time, short enough to be used from horseback, but its construction made it far more powerful than its size suggested. Built from layers of horn, sinew, and wood laminated together, the composite bow could store and release energy with exceptional efficiency. Its effective range was somewhere around 160 to 170 yards, and in skilled hands, it could penetrate armor at distances that left the person wearing that armor feeling rather underserved by it. The bow took years to make properly, and was sensitive to moisture, which is why Mongol soldiers kept their bow cases wrapped in waterproof covers and carried multiple bows on campaign. Losing your bow was roughly equivalent in Mongol military terms to a modern soldier losing his rifle and most of his ammunition simultaneously. Each Mongol soldier went to war with multiple horses, typically 3 to 5 per man, which gave the army a logistical capacity that no other force of the era could match. A tired horse was simply swapped for a fresh one, and the pace of advance could be maintained, across distances that would have exhausted a European or Chinese cavalry force completely. Mongol armies regularly covered distances in days that their opponents expected to take weeks. This speed was not accidental. It was a deliberate operational advantage cultivated and maintained through constant attention to the horse supply. The army divided its cavalry into two broad categories that worked together as a system. Light cavalry, the horse archers would engage the enemy at range, circling, probing, drawing responses, and retreating just fast enough to stay out of effective counter range. Heavy cavalry armed with lances and wearing leather or lamela armor were held back until the moment was right for a decisive strike. The coordination between the two required disciplined communication and a shared understanding of the battle plan at every level of command, from the general down to the unit of 10. The feigned retreat was the Mongol tactic that broke more enemy armies than perhaps any other single maneuver. A force of light cavalry would engage, appear to be getting the worst of it, and then turn and flee. Enemy forces, particularly those from cultures that valued aggressive pursuit as a mark of battlefield virtue, would break formation to chase them. The retreating Mongols would pull the pursuing force over ground of their own choosing, stretching it out, separating the fast riders from the slow ones, drawing it away from its support. Then, when the pursuing force was sufficiently disordered and committed, the heavy cavalry would appear from concealed positions on the flanks. The light cavalry would wheel and come back. The pursuit became a trap, and the trapped force found itself surrounded and attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. Armies that understood this tactic and tried to resist the urge to pursue still found it difficult to hold their formation steady against riders who could maintain a controlled retreat at high speed while continuing to fire arrows backward over their horses' tails. Before any major campaign, Genghis Khan invested serious time and resources in intelligence. Mongol agents traveled ahead of the army as merchants, pilgrims and traders, gathering information about roads, water sources, fortifications, garrison sizes, political tensions within the target state, and the loyalties of border populations. By the time the army actually moved, its commanders typically knew more about the terrain and the political situation of the country they were entering than many of that country's own provincial governors did. This intelligence work was not glamorous and has received far less attention in the historical record than the battles themselves. But it was arguably just as important as anything that happened on the field. Psychological operations were used with the same deliberate intention as cavalry maneuvers. The Mongol approach to an enemy city typically followed a clear sequence. Messengers were sent first, offering terms of surrender. If the city submitted, it was generally spared, required to provide supplies and tribute, and left largely intact. If it resisted, the city was warned explicitly what would follow. If it still resisted, and was then taken by force, the destruction was comprehensive and intentional, not merely as punishment for the specific city, but as a message to every other city in the region about the cost of resistance. Word of what had happened to a city that refused to submit traveled ahead of the army faster than the army itself could move, and many subsequent cities opened their gates before a single Mongol soldier came within sight of their walls. Terror was in this sense a logistical tool. It reduced the number of sieges the army had to fight. Siege warfare was the one area where the steppe background offered no natural advantage, and Genghis Khan handled this gap the same way he handled most problems, by finding people who already knew how to do it and putting them to work. Chinese engineers captured or recruited during the early campaigns against the Xia and the Jin Dynasty were incorporated into the army and given resources to build and operate the full range of siege equipment: trebuchets, battering rams, siege towers, and systems for undermining walls. Persian and Central Asian specialists joined later. The Mongol army that attacked cities in the middle of its imperial expansion was carrying with it a considerable library of borrowed technical knowledge. Operated by specialists from half a dozen different cultures, the Imperial Guard, the Kesig, served a function that went well beyond personal protection for the Khan. It was simultaneously a bodyguard, an administrative corps, and a training ground for future commanders. Young men from across the empire, including the sons of defeated enemies, were brought into the Kes, where they received direct exposure to how the Mongol state was governed, how campaigns were planned, and how decisions were made at the highest level. Those who showed ability moved outward from the Kesig into command positions across the empire. It was in effect an officer school and a civil service academy combined, and it produced a generation of administrators and generals who shared a common framework and a common loyalty to the center. Women within the Mongol system held a position that would have surprised observers from most other contemporary cultures. While they did not typically serve in combat roles, they managed the logistical base, the herds, the gears, the supply trains with a degree of autonomous authority that was real rather than ceremonial. The wives of senior commanders and the great Khan himself held recognized power within their arc, could negotiate on behalf of their husbands, and in some cases exercise direct political judgment. Börte, throughout Genghis Khan's campaigns, remained a trusted advisor whose opinions on matters of succession and alliance he took seriously. This was not incidental. It was built into the structure of a society where men spent extended periods on campaign, and the entire domestic and logistical operation had to function without them. Communication across the battlefield was handled through flag signals and smoke, with each tumen maintaining its own system of relay. Across the wider empire, a courier network, called the Yam, moved messages between commanders at speeds that were for the medieval period genuinely remarkable. Relay stations were set up at regular intervals across the steppe, each stocked with fresh horses. A message could travel from one end of the Mongol operational theater to the other in a matter of days rather than weeks. This kept Genghis Khan informed and in control of campaigns that were sometimes unfolding simultaneously in completely different parts of the world. A coordination challenge that would have broken most military systems of the era. What the Mongol War Machine amounted to, taken as a whole, was a combined arms force built on speed, intelligence, psychological pressure, and disciplined execution applied by men who had spent their entire lives developing exactly the physical and mental skills the system required. It was not invincible. It had real weaknesses, particularly in naval operations and in densely forested or jungle terrain. But on the open steppe, on the plains of China and across the broad agricultural heartlands of Central Asia, it was as close to unstoppable as anything the medieval world had seen. The army that rode south in the years after Stoti VI was about to demonstrate exactly that. Fire across China. The first target south of the steppe was not the Jin Dynasty. It was the Tangut kingdom of Xia, the buffer state occupying the northwestern corridor between Mongolia and China proper. This was a deliberate choice. Xia was large enough to be worth conquering, and small enough to be manageable as a first major campaign against a settled walled civilization. It also sat directly across the main routes between Mongolia and the Jin heartland, which meant that leaving it unconquered while turning east would have been a serious strategic error. Genghis Khan launched his first campaign into Xia territory around 112-9, and the experience taught the Mongol army several things it needed to learn before tackling anything larger. The Tangut people had built their kingdom over roughly 2 centuries across a difficult landscape of desert, mountain, and semi-arid plateau. Their capital, Zhongqing, sat on the Yellow River, surrounded by walls and defended by a garrison accustomed to holding fortified positions. The Mongols, moving in from the north, could sweep across open country with their usual speed and efficiency, but they ran into immediate difficulty when they reached anything with walls around it. The first attempts to take fortified Tangut cities involved tactics carried over from steppe, raiding fast approaches, arrow fire, psychological pressure, and these worked poorly against stone and packed earth defenses manned by disciplined defenders who had no reason to come outside and fight in the open. The campaign against Zhongqing involved one of the more creative, if unsuccessful, attempts at siege engineering in the early Mongol record. The Mongols diverted water from the Yellow River to flood the city's defenses. The plan had a certain logical appeal. Water where walls stand tends to undermine both, but the execution went badly. The improvised dikes failed. The flood spread in directions that were not intended, and the Mongol camp itself ended up inundated. It is the kind of story that historians tend to record with a slightly raised eyebrow, and the Mongol commanders involved presumably felt the same way about it in real time. The city held. The campaign was eventually concluded not through assault, but through a negotiated submission. The Xia ruler agreed to pay tribute, offer a daughter and marriage to Genghis Khan, and provide military support for future Mongol operations. The formal conquest of Xia would come later and under different circumstances, but for now, the campaign had accomplished enough. The corridor was open. The turn toward the Jin dynasty came in 1211, and it was a campaign of an entirely different scale. The Jin ruled northern China, a territory containing tens of millions of people, dozens of major fortified cities, a standing army of several 100,000 soldiers, and the accumulated wealth of one of the most productive agricultural civilizations on Earth. The Jin also had the Great Wall running along the northern edge of their territory, a barrier that had been built and maintained over many centuries specifically to manage threats from the steppe. The Mongol army crossed it without enormous difficulty, partly because the wall is more impressive as a concept than as a practical military obstacle against a force that can find the gaps, and partly because some of the garrison commanders along the northern frontier made the decision under varying degrees of pressure to step aside rather than resist. What followed over the next several years was not a single decisive campaign, but a series of devastating raids and systematic military operations that progressively stripped the Jin of their ability to defend their northern territories. Mongol columns moved through the countryside in multiple directions simultaneously, destroying crops, taking cities, killing or scattering garrisons. The Jin army, which was large and reasonably well equipped, was outmaneuvered repeatedly by the Mongol combination of speed and coordinated multi-column operations. When the Jin forces tried to mass for a conventional pitched battle, the Mongols would decline engagement and slip away, only to reappear somewhere else entirely. When the Jin dispersed to cover their many vulnerabilities, they found themselves picked apart, piece by piece. One of the more significant early engagements was the Battle of Yehuling in 1211, where a large Jin force moving to intercept the Mongols was caught in a valley and effectively destroyed. It was not a small engagement. The Jin force numbered in the hundreds of thousands by some estimates, though, as with many medieval army figures, those numbers should be treated with some caution. What is clear is that the battle was decisive, that the Jin lost a significant portion of their field army in a single afternoon, and that the Mongols suffered comparatively light casualties through a combination of superior tactical flexibility and the brutal efficiency of the Feigned retreat applied at scale. The Jin emperor, facing an increasingly dire military situation, made a political decision that had significant consequences. He moved his capital southward from Zhongdu, the city that now underlies modern Beijing, to Qiang, deep in the Jin heartland. From a personal safety standpoint, this was reasonable. From a political standpoint, it was catastrophic. The populations of the northern territories, already under Mongol military pressure, interpreted the emperor's departure as abandonment. Jin generals in the north began defecting to the Mongols with their troops and their local knowledge. The entire northern military structure began to dissolve from within. Zhongdu fell in 1215. The city had been under intermittent siege and pressure for several years, and by the time it was finally taken, its population had been reduced by famine and disease to a fraction of what it had been. The Mongols entered a city that was already partly a ruin and completed the process. Marco Polo, traveling through northern China decades later, still described vast stretches of the region in terms that made clear how severe and lasting the destruction had been. The bones of the dead were visible along the roads. Entire districts that had been densely populated living communities were empty. The scale of population loss in northern China during the Mongol campaigns against the Jin is one of the most sobering numbers in medieval history. Even accounting for the significant uncertainty in medieval demographic estimates, northern China may have lost somewhere between a third and a half of its population over the course of the Jin campaigns, to direct violence, to famine caused by agricultural disruption, and to the diseases that follow both. Cities that had been among the largest urban centers in the world were reduced to rubble and scattered survivors. It was a transformation so thorough that it reshaped the human geography of northern China for generations. Within this destruction, Genghis Khan was already doing something that ran slightly against the image of pure obliteration. He was collecting administrators. Among the most significant figures he encountered during the northern China campaigns was a man named Yesügei, a Khitan nobleman who had been serving the Jin court. Yesügei was a scholar, a Confucian administrator, and a man of considerable intellectual depth, who apparently had a conversation with Genghis Khan that went on long enough for each of them to develop a genuine respect for the other. Genghis Khan took him on as an advisor, and Yesügei would spend the rest of his career arguing with considerable effect that the agricultural populations of conquered territories were worth more alive and taxed than dead and plundered. This was not a self-evident point to everyone in the Mongol leadership, and it took persistence to make it stick. But it did stick, at least partially, and Yesügei's influence on how the empire managed its settled subjects was real and lasting. The northern China campaigns also demonstrated something that would become a consistent pattern in Mongol expansion. The empire was functionally incapable of governing vast agricultural territories using only its own people. The Mongols were brilliant at conquest. Administration was a different skill set, one that required literacy, familiarity with local, legal, and tax systems, and the patience to manage complex, bureaucratic structures over long periods without things falling apart. They needed people who already knew how to do these things, and they were on balance practical enough to use them. By the time the Jin campaigns had consumed most of the north, Genghis Khan's attention was already turning westward. The Xia situation remained unresolved in a final sense. The Silk Road trade routes that ran through Central Asia had come to his attention through the reports of merchants and his own intelligence network, and somewhere beyond the great mountain passes that divided Mongolia from the Islamic world, a powerful empire called the Khwarazmian ruled an enormous arc of territory, from Persia to the borders of India. He had not planned to go there. Events and one particularly catastrophic diplomatic decision by the Khwarazmian Shah would make the choice for him. Life on the steppe and Silk Road. While the armies moved south and east, the world they came from continued turning at its own pace. The Mongol heartland, the plateau, the river valleys, the wide summer pastures had its own rhythms and its own texture, and understanding what daily life actually looked like for the people living within it gives the whole story a foundation that the campaigns alone cannot provide. The empire was not just an army in motion. It was a society with its own structure, its own pleasures, its own rules about who sat where and who wore what, and what you were allowed to put in your bowl. The chair was the physical center of Mongol life, and it was a more sophisticated structure than it might appear from the outside. The round felt walls were mounted on a collapsible lattice frame of willow wood, the roof held up by a central ring that also served as the smoke hole for the fire burning below. A well-made jur could be assembled by an experienced family in under an hour and taken down almost as quickly. Inside, the space was organized according to a strict spatial logic that every Mongol understood instinctively. The right side of the gear, as you entered, facing north, was the women's side, where household tools, cooking equipment, and food stores were kept. The left side belonged to the men's saddles, weapons, and riding equipment. The northern section directly opposite the entrance was the place of honor, where the family's most sacred objects were kept, and where distinguished guests were seated. The fire occupied the center. The door always faced south, toward the warmth. Foreign visitors, who wandered into a jair and sat on the wrong side without realizing it could cause genuine social discomfort. And those who stepped on the threshold on their way in, which was considered deeply bad luck, were sometimes required to perform a small ritual cleansing to put things right. It was by any measure a spatial system with a level of specificity that put most modern domestic arrangement conventions to shame. Mongol society in the early imperial period was structured into several broadly recognized categories, and the differences between them were visible in daily life, in quite practical ways. At the top sat the nobility, the Nuan, those born into clans with established leadership lineage, particularly the Borgugan and other groups historically connected to power. By the time of the empire, Nuan families had access to silk, which arrived in enormous quantities from China as tribute and trade. Silk was not merely decorative in this context. On the steppe, a silk undershirt worn beneath armor had the practical advantage of not shredding on contact with an arrowhead, the way wool or leather did, which made it considerably easier to remove an arrow from a wound of silk, wrapping around the point rather than tearing. The Nuan also wore elaborate robes in bright colors, often trimmed with furs from the forest regions to the north, sable, ermine, and squirrel. The quality and quantity of fur on a person's clothing communicated their standing without requiring anyone to make an announcement about it. The free warriors and herders, the bulk of Mongol society, dressed in a combination of leather, wool, felt, and whatever they could obtain through trade or raid. Their primary outer garment was the deel, a long wrap robe fastened at the right side, warm and practical, ideally suited to life in the saddle. In winter, sheepskin layers went underneath, and boots were made from thick leather, with full upturned toes that prevented them from catching in the stirrups. Their diet centered on what the animals around them provided. Fermented Mars milk, called areg, and known to the outside world more often by the Turk term kumis, was the drink of the steppe, consumed in substantial quantities at all hours of the day. It was mildly alcoholic, tangy, and according to nearly every foreign visitor who encountered it for the first time, an experience that took some adjustment. Most of the medieval observers who described it in writing were, diplomatically speaking, not enthusiastic, though they generally noted that Mongols seemed to find this reaction puzzling. Dried meat bots was a staple that could be reduced to a powder and reconstituted with water, lasting for months without spoiling. On campaign, a soldier might carry a small bag of it, capable of sustaining him for extended periods with minimal weight. This was not gourmet military provisioning, but it was extraordinarily efficient, and efficiency on campaign mattered more than flavor. Fresh meat was eaten when available, and large communal feasts involving roasted animals were a feature of celebrations, victories, and the great gatherings of leadership. Millet and some grain arrived through trade, supplemented by wild plants gathered during the seasonal migrations. Below the free herders and warriors, and distinct from them, were the artisans, blacksmiths, felt makers, saddlers, and bow makers, whose skills were essential to the functioning of the whole system, and who occupied a recognized, if not particularly elevated, social position. And then there were the bog-hole slaves, mostly drawn from captured peoples, who performed household labor and could be transferred as property between owners. Slavery on the Mongolian steppe was not a fixed hereditary caste, in the way it functioned in some other societies. A capable person who caught the attention of a powerful owner might be elevated substantially. Several of Genghis Khan's most trusted figures had origins in captured or subject peoples. As the empire expanded, the social texture of Mongol life began to absorb outside elements with surprising speed. Chinese silk and ceramics moved into noble gur. Persian metalwork and glassware appeared in the camps of senior commanders, Buddhist monks, and Nitorian Christian priests and Muslim traders all moved through the empire's growing network of roads and relay stations. The Mongols did not insist that their subjects dress like them, eat like them, or pray like them. What they insisted on was submission, taxation, and the unimpeded movement of goods, people and information across their territory. The Silk Road, the loose network of trade routes connecting China to Central Asia, Persia, and eventually the Mediterranean, had existed in various forms for over 1,000 years before the Mongols. But it had always been fragmented, different sections controlled by different powers, burdened with different taxes and tariffs, disrupted by wars and political instability. The Mongol expansion, whatever its costs in human terms, had the effect of unifying an enormous stretch of those routes under a single administrative system for the first time. Merchants who traveled under Mongol protection, carrying a tablet called a PA that identified them as authorized traders, could move from China to Persia to the Black Sea with a degree of physical safety that was genuinely unprecedented. The Mongols actively cultivated this trade. Revenue from commerce flowed into the imperial treasury, and Genghis Khan established a system of merchant partnerships called the autoto, through which the empire itself invested capital in trading ventures and shared in the profits. The goods that moved through this system were varied and valuable. Silk and porcelain from China flowed westward. Cotton, textiles, spices, and horses moved eastward. Furs from the Siberian north moved in multiple directions. Books, ideas, diseases, technologies, and artistic styles traveled along with the merchandise. A Persian astronomer's methods might reach the court of Kublai Khan. A Chinese printing technique might appear in a workshop in Trey. The empire was porous to influence in both directions, even as it was politically unified under Mongol authority. Daily entertainment on the steppe took forms that required neither buildings nor elaborate equipment. Wrestling was the most celebrated physical competition, occupying a central place in Mongol festival culture that it still holds today. Horse racing over distances that would dwarf any modern track event tested both the animal and the rider. Ankle bone games, played with the small bones of sheep as dice and counters, were ubiquitous. Across all ages and social levels, music was woven through daily life, played on the morinkur, a two-stringed instrument with a carved horse's head at the top of its neck, whose low resonant sound the Mongols associated with the landscape itself, with the open steppe and the movement of horses across it. This was the world behind the conquests. Practical, mobile, structured in its own way, and more internally coherent than the outside world, looking at it from a distance, tended to assume. The people who built the largest land empire in history were not simply warriors. They were a society with layered customs, genuine aesthetic sensibilities, and a framework of daily meaning that sustained them through decades of constant expansion and change. The camps that followed the armies were communities, not just supply lines, and the juras that went up each night at the edge of a new conquest carried the steppe's version of home along with them wherever they went. The wrath of the West, the Khwarazmian Empire, in the second decade of the 13th century, was one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world. It stretched from the Caspian Sea in the west, across Persia, through the rich cities of Transoxiana, Samarkand, Bukhara, and Urgent among them south into Afghanistan and the edges of northern India. Its ruler, Shah Muhammad II, had spent the previous decade aggressively expanding his territory, absorbing the remnants of the Seljuk Sultanate and positioning himself as a dominant force across Central Asia. His army was large, his cities were wealthy, and by 1217 or so, he had every reason to consider himself the most formidable ruler between the Mediterranean and the borders of China. Genghis Khan did not initially approach the Khwarazmian Empire as an enemy. He approached it as a trading partner. The Mongols by this point controlled enormous stretches of the overland trade routes, and the logical extension of that position was to open formal commercial relations with the states. At the western end of those routes, a large caravan, somewhere in the range of 450 merchants, and an enormous quantity of goods, including gold, silver, silk, and furs, was dispatched toward Khwarazmian territory with a formal letter from Genghis Khan, proposing trade and peaceful relations. The caravan reached the Khwarazmian frontier city of Otra, where it was met by the governor, a man named Inelchuk, who bore the honorific title Kardia Kun. What Inelchuk did next is one of those historical decisions that seems difficult to explain, even in the most charitable possible terms. He accused the merchants of being spies, which some of them possibly were, since Mongol trade missions did tend to gather intelligence as a matter of course, and had the entire caravan seized and its members executed. He then kept the goods for himself. Genghis Khan sent a diplomatic mission to Shah Muhammad demanding justice for the massacre, specifically asking that Inaluk be handed over to face consequences for what he had done. Shah Muhammad's response was to have the lead Mongol ambassador killed and the others sent back, with their beards shaved off, which in the cultural context of the steppe was a profound and deliberate humiliation. It is genuinely difficult looking back across 800 years of history to identify a diplomatic communication that achieved worse results for its sender. Muhammad had just told the ruler of the most powerful military force in the known world that he was not worth the courtesy of a civil reply. The Mongols began moving west the following year. The campaign that followed, launched in 1219, was the largest military operation Genghis Khan had directed to that point. He divided his forces into multiple columns, moving on different axes simultaneously, exploiting the enormous geographic depth of the Khwarazmian Empire against itself. Shah Muhammad, who had distributed his army across dozens of garrisons to defend his many cities, rather than concentrating it for a decisive field battle, found himself unable to mass effective resistance against an enemy that could appear from unexpected directions faster than messengers could relay warnings. Otra was surrounded and besieged. After several months of resistance, it fell in Elshuk. The governor whose decision to massacre the trade caravan had set all of this in motion was captured alive. He was executed in a manner that the sources describe with a specificity, suggesting it was understood to be a deliberate statement. Molten silver was poured into his eyes and ears. It was a death calibrated to the crime of greed and to the insult that had followed it. Bukhara, one of the great cities of the Islamic world, a center of scholarship, architecture, and commerce that had been producing poets, mathematicians, and theologians for centuries, fell in 1220. The Mongol army entered through gates that the city's Turkish garrison had abandoned in a failed attempt at escape, leaving the civilian population to negotiate its own fate. Genghis Khan rode into the city's great mosque, and what followed was a scene recorded in several Islamic sources. He addressed the assembled population and told them their sins had brought this upon them, that he was the punishment of God. Whether he believed this in any sincere theological sense, or whether he understood the rhetorical utility of framing conquest in terms his audience recognized, is not entirely clear. The practical outcome was the same regardless. Bukhara was stripped of its wealth. Much of the city burned. A population that had numbered in the hundreds of thousands was scattered. Samarkand, the empire's showpiece city, home to enormous bazaars, elaborate gardens, and some of the finest architecture in Central Asia, fell not long after. Its garrison attempted resistance and was destroyed. The civilian population submitted and was largely spared immediate violence, though a significant portion was conscripted to serve as labor and human shields in subsequent siege operations. The city itself survived in a physical sense better than Bukhara had, though its population and commercial life took generations to recover to anything near their ruin. Pre-conquest levels. Shah Muhammad himself did not stay to defend his cities. He fled westward as the Mongol columns advanced, and Genghis Khan sent two of his most capable generals, Subutai and Ögedei, with a force of roughly 20,000 men to pursue him specifically, with instructions not to return until the Shah was dead or captured. Muhammad fled through Persia, always barely ahead of the pursuit, until he reached the Caspian Sea, crossed to a small island, and died there of pleurisy sick alone, stripped of his empire, reportedly having to beg the people on the island for a burial shroud because his own resources had run out entirely. He had ruled one of the most powerful empires in the Islamic world, and he ended his life as a refugee on a tiny island with nothing left to his name. It was, as historical reversals go, fairly complete. The destruction that accompanied the Khwarazmian campaign was among the most severe in the entire history of Mongol expansion. The city of MV one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Central Asia, a major center of Islamic learning and commerce, was taken, and its population was massacred with a thoroughness that the medieval sources record in numbers so large that modern historians believe they must be exaggerated, while still acknowledging the underlying reality that the destruction was catastrophic. Nishapur was similarly devastated, partly in retaliation for the death of Genghis Khan, son-in-law during the siege. Urgent, the Khwarazmian capital on the Oxus River, held out longest and was taken only after a brutal urban battle. Afterward, the Mongols diverted the river to flood the ruins, ensuring that even the physical remnants would not easily serve as a basis for rebuilding. The agricultural systems of Khorasan, the intricate network of underground irrigation channels called kunats, that had sustained dense populations across an otherwise semi-arid landscape for centuries, were destroyed during the campaigns and in many cases were not repaired for generations. The human and ecological impact of the Khwarazmian campaign reshaped Central Asia in ways that are still visible in the historical record of the region's population density and agricultural productivity for the following 2 centuries. While all of this was unfolding in the cities and farmlands of Persia and Transoxiana, Subutai and Jebe, having lost the Shah to his island death, did not simply turn around. With the original mission technically complete, they received permission to continue their reconnaissance in force through Persia into Azerbaijan and Georgia around the southern edge of the Caucasus Mountains, and then north into the Russian steppe. What followed was an 18-month sweep through territory the Mongols had never previously entered, in which they defeated a Georgian army, outmaneuvered the Alan and Cuman peoples of the steppe, and finally met a combined Russian and Cuman force at the Kalka River in 1223. The Russian princes who assembled at the Kalka River came from several different principalities, and they did not coordinate effectively with each other or with the Cuman horsemen they were nominally fighting alongside. The battle was short and decisive. The Mongol force was outnumbered. This was a reconnaissance expedition, not a full invasion, but outfought the coalition through tactical discipline and the feigned retreat applied with characteristic precision. Several Russian princes who were captured were laid on the ground covered with wooden platforms, and the Mongol commanders ate their victory feast on top of them. It was a statement as much as a method of execution. Subutai and Jebe then turned east and rejoined the main army. The Battle of the Kalka River was not a conquest. The Mongols would not return to Russia in force for another decade and a half. It was a warning that nobody in the Russian principalities seems to have taken quite seriously. Willin, the death of the great Khan. Genghis Khan returned to the Mongolian plateau from the western campaigns in 1225, and for a brief period, things settled into a relative quiet that was, by his standards, almost unfamiliar. He was somewhere in his early 60s. The exact year of his birth remains uncertain enough that historians allow themselves a few years of flexibility in either direction, and he had spent the better part of 4 decades in nearly constant motion. The campaigns against the Xia, the Jin, and then the Khwarazmian Empire had followed one another with barely a pause between them. The steppe in summer, the Feldgare at night, the smell of horses and dried meat and woods. These were the constants of a life that had never really stopped moving since those years beside the Onan River. But there was one piece of unfinished business that he could not leave alone. The Xia, the Tangut kingdom that had submitted to Mongol authority years earlier and agreed to provide military support for future campaigns, had failed to send troops when called upon during the Khwarazmian operation. Their king had reportedly sent back a dismissive response, suggesting that if the Mongols needed help to fight their wars, perhaps they should reconsider the wars they were starting. This was in the political vocabulary of the Mongol Empire, an act of defiance that carried a very well-established set of consequences. Genghis Khan had made it clear throughout his career that agreements were binding, and that breaking them had a specific and consistent price. Leaving the Tangut response unanswered would have communicated something he had no interest in communicating. The final campaign against Xia began in 1226. It was large and methodically organized, moving through Tangut territory with the same systematic thoroughness that had characterized the Western campaigns. Cities fell one after another. The Tangut military resistance, which had been more resilient in earlier encounters, was overwhelmed by the scale and coordination of the attack. By 1227, the Mongol forces had the Tangut capital under siege, and the kingdom's collapse was a matter of time rather than outcome. What happened to Genghis Khan personally during this final campaign is one of those historical questions that the sources approach from several different directions and never quite resolve. The most widely accepted account holds that he suffered a significant fall from his horse during a hunt before or during the campaign, sustaining internal injuries serious enough to affect his health for the remainder of the operation. He continued directing the campaign despite this, which was consistent with how he had always managed his own physical condition as something to be worked through rather than accommodated. A later tradition recorded in some sources suggests a more colorful cause of death, involving a Tangut royal woman, a concealed weapon, and a highly inconvenient moment. But this account is almost certainly a story that attached itself to the historical record later rather than a description of what actually happened. History has a tendency to generate interesting explanations for the deaths of important people, regardless of whether those explanations are true. What the sources agree on is that Genghis Khan died in August of 1227, while the Xia campaign was still in its final stages. He was somewhere in his early to mid-60s. The Tangut capital fell shortly after, and the Xia kingdom was dismantled with a thoroughness that went beyond the typical terms of Mongol conquest. The ruling lineage was eliminated, the population was severely reduced, and the cultural and administrative structure of the Tangut state was effectively destroyed. Some historians have read this as a final act of personal vengeance carried out by commanders, following instructions he had given before his death. Others read it simply as the inevitable conclusion of a campaign that had already been decided militarily. Either way, the Xia ceased to exist as a political entity at almost exactly the moment their conqueror did. The body of Genghis Khan was carried back to Mongolia, and funerary arrangements that followed were conducted with a secrecy that was, even by the standards of an empire accustomed to operational discretion, extraordinary. The procession that carried him home reportedly killed everyone it encountered along the route: travelers, herders, anyone who might have seen where the body was going and be able to describe the location afterward. When the burial was complete, the site was concealed through a combination of deliberate landscape alteration and, according to some accounts, driving horses repeatedly over the ground to erase any visible trace. The soldiers who had completed the burial were then also killed, and the specific location was known thereafter only to those few people who had reason to know, and every reason to keep quiet about it. The grave of Genghis Khan has never been found. Modern archaeological surveys using satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and traditional excavation methods have located many things in the Mongolian landscape from that period. None of them have located him. He managed in death to achieve a degree of privacy that had entirely eluded him in life. The question of succession had not been left entirely unresolved. Genghis Khan had addressed it in his practical and direct fashion years before his death. He had 4 sons by Börte Yesügei, Chagatai, Ögedei, and Tui, and the succession question was complicated from the beginning by the uncertainty surrounding Yoshi's paternity. Joki was the oldest, which should have made him the natural first candidate, but Chagatai had made his feelings about Joi's legitimacy publicly clear on more than one occasion, and the tension between the two brothers was severe enough that having either of them succeed risked an immediate civil war. Ögedei was the compromise, a man known for his generous temperament, his political skill, and an ability to maintain relationships across competing factions that his brothers lacked. Genghis Khan had designated him as successor in a formal gathering years before the final campaign. And while there was a period of regency under Tui, while the Kurultai assembled to confirm the choice, the transition was ultimately completed without the violent fracture that might easily have followed. What Genghis Khan left behind at the moment of his death was genuinely staggering in scale. The empire stretched from the Pacific coast of China westward across Central Asia to the edges of Persia. It encompassed a larger area than the Roman Empire at its greatest extent, than the empire of Alexander of Macedon, any other political entity the world had produced to that point. It included populations speaking dozens of languages and practicing half a dozen major religions. It had a functioning postal system, a legal code, a structure of administration that, however, imperfectly kept the whole thing coordinated across distances that would have defeated most communication systems of the era. He had been born with nothing, in a felt tent named after a captured enemy by a father who would be dead before his 10th birthday. The clan that should have protected his family had walked away when he was a child. He had worn a wooden collar around his neck as a prisoner before he was old enough to shave. The distance between that beginning and the empire he left at his death is one of the most extreme, personal trajectories in all of recorded history. And it was not achieved through luck or through inheritance or through a single dramatic act of will. It was achieved through 40 years of relentless, patient, disciplined work, of building loyalty where none existed, of learning from defeat as carefully as from victory, of making hard decisions consistently and early enough to matter. His personal character, beyond the military reputation, was more nuanced than the straightforward portrait of a destroyer allows. He was deeply loyal to those who had been loyal to him, men like Subutai Jebe and the family of Soren Shira, who had helped him escape the Taichi Kango as boy, and whom he rewarded generously when he had the power to do so. He was genuinely curious about the world's religions, holding conversations with Buddhist monks, Taoist masters, and Islamic scholars, with what appears to have been authentic interest rather than mere performance. He had a consistent policy of religious tolerance within the empire that was unusual for a ruler of any era. He valued competence above birth in a way that was for the 12th and 13th centuries nearly revolutionary. He was also responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people directly through the campaigns he ordered, and indirectly through the agricultural and demographic destruction his wars left behind. These two facts are not in contradiction. They simply describe the same person. The empire he had built was now in the hands of his sons and their sons after them. Whether it would hold together or pull apart was a question that had no certain answer in 1227. For the moment it held, and for the moment that was extraordinary enough. Ögedei and the empire expanding. Ögedei Khan was not his father, and he did not try to be. Where Genghis Khan had been a man of personal physical toughness, relentless focus, and a certain austere quality in his leadership style, Ögedei was sociable, generous to a fault, and possessed of an enthusiasm for wine that those around him found charming right up until the point where it became a medical concern. He hosted feasts that lasted for days. He gave gifts with an open-handedness that occasionally alarmed his administrators. He was by multiple accounts genuinely well liked by the people who served him, which was itself a governing asset in an empire that depended on the personal loyalty of dozens of powerful regional commanders. The formal Keraites that confirmed him as Great Khan took place in 1229, 2 years after his father's death. The delay had been managed by Tolui, the youngest of Genghis Khan's 4 main sons, who acted as regent and kept the machinery of the empire running while the senior leaders assembled from across the enormous territory the empire now covered. The confirmation was not without tension. Chagatai, the second son, was as prickly and difficult as he had always been, and the question of Joy's line, now represented by Joy's sons Batu and Order, continued to carry a particular political charge. But Ögedei's designation had been his father's explicit wish, and overriding it openly would have required more will and more unity of opposition than anyone actually had. The empire moved forward under new leadership. One of Ögedei's first and most significant decisions was to build a permanent capital. The Mongols had always governed from the saddle, from moving camps and seasonal stopping points, and while this worked well enough for a steppe confederation, it was increasingly inadequate for an empire that needed to receive ambassadors, process taxation, store records, and coordinate administration across a territory that now stretched from the Pacific to Persia. The city of Karakorum in central Mongolia was developed into a proper imperial capital, built largely by craftsmen and engineers brought in from conquered territories containing workshops, temples, mosques, churches, and the great palace of Ögedei himself. It was not a large city by the standards of the places the Mongols had conquered. A Venetian traveler who visited it years later noted with diplomatic honesty that the city was considerably less impressive than the village of Saint-Denis outside Paris. But it was a capital in the functional sense, a fixed point around which the administrative life of the empire could organize itself, and that was what mattered. The unfinished campaign against the Jin Dynasty was completed under Ögedei's direction. The Jin had retreated to their southern territories after the fall of Zhongdu, pulling their court to Qiang and attempting to rebuild behind the protection of the Yellow River and the vast population of their remaining territory. The Mongols, lacking a strong naval capability and finding river crossings genuinely difficult, took some years to close the distance. An alliance was formed with the southern Song dynasty, the ethnic Chinese state south of the Jin, who saw the Mongol campaign against the Jin as an opportunity to recover territories they had lost generations earlier. The Song provided forces that helped pressure the Jin from the south, while the Mongols pushed from the north and west. The last Jin emperor died in 1234, reportedly by his own hand, as the final city of resistance fell around him. The Jin dynasty, which had ruled northern China for over a century, ceased to exist. Ögedei then turned his attention west. The Cuman and Russian territories that Subutai and Jebe had raided in 1223 had never been formally incorporated into the empire. They represented both a threat. The Cumans were mobile steppe warriors who could potentially organize effective resistance on the Ken, their own ground, and an opportunity. A great western campaign was planned, commanded nominally by Batu Khan, Joy's son and now the senior representative of that line, with Subutai as the operational mastermind. The force that assembled for this campaign in 1236 was large, well supplied, and led by some of the most experienced commanders the Mongol system had produced. The Vulgar Bulgars, whose territory lay north of the Caspian Sea, were the first major obstacle and were overrun efficiently. Then the Mongol columns turned toward the Russian principalities, a collection of independent city-states that were politically fragmented, frequently at war with each other, and in no position to mount coordinated resistance to a unified force of this quality. The city of Ryazan was taken and destroyed in December of 1237. Vladimir Suzdal and a string of other cities followed in quick succession through the brutal winter of 1237–38. The Mongols operated effectively in deep winter conditions that would have slowed most other armies. Frozen rivers served as highways for their cavalry, and the cold that immobilized defenders behind their city walls simply did not immobilize the Mongol army in the same way. A combined Russian force attempted to make a stand at the Sit River in March of 1238, and was defeated with the thoroughness that had come to characterize Mongol engagements with organized resistance. The Grand Prince of Vladimir was among the dead. Russian resistance as a coordinated political phenomenon effectively collapsed, though individual cities continued to resist, and the forested northern city of Novgorod was never reached the spring thaw. Turning the ground to mud that would swallow horses and wagons stopped the advance before it got there. The army regrouped on the steppe, absorbed supplies and reinforcements, and in 1240 pushed into the southern Russian territories with renewed force. Kiev, one of the oldest and most important cities in the Slavic world, a center of Orthodox Christianity and a city of genuine architectural beauty, was besieged and taken in December of 1240. The destruction was severe. A Franciscan friar named Giovanni de Pandel-Carpin, who traveled through the area several years later on a diplomatic mission to the Mongol court, described passing through the landscape around Kiev and seeing skulls and bones covering the ground across a vast area, the remnants of a population that had been enormous and was now almost gone. From the Russian steppe, the campaign divided. One column pushed northwest into Poland. Another drove southwest into Hungary. The Polish column, moving rapidly through Silesia, encountered a combined force of Polish knights, Teutonic knights, and other German military orders at a place called Lenica in April of 1241. The battle lasted less than a day. The European force was destroyed. A relief force from Bohemia, riding hard to arrive in time, reached the battlefield 2 days after the fighting had finished. The Mongol column did not pursue significantly into the German principalities beyond it, turned south to rejoin the main effort in Hungary. Hungary was the primary strategic target. King Bela IV assembled a substantial army and marched east to meet the Mongol advance at the Mohay crossing on the Sejo River. The Battle of Mohay, fought in April of 1241, on roughly the same day as Lenica, was a comprehensive Mongol victory. The Hungarian army was encircled, then offered a deliberate gap in the encirclement, and as soldiers poured through what they believed was an escape route, they were cut down in a running pursuit across open ground. Bela survived by fleeing to the Adriatic coast and eventually to an island. The Mongol advance overran Hungary, reaching the Adriatic Sea. By the end of 1241, Western Europe lay open ahead. The Holy Roman Empire had received frantic letters from Batu, warning of what was coming. There was no coordinated response that amounted to anything effective. And then Ögedei Khan died in December of 1241, in Karakorum, a continent away from the campaign his commanders were winning. The cause was almost certainly his long-running enthusiasm for wine, which his physicians had been attempting to moderate for years with limited success. The senior Mongol commanders in Europe, including Batu and Subutai, were required by law and custom to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai that would determine the next great Khan. The campaign stopped. The army withdrew from Hungary and Poland. Europe, which had been watching the eastern horizon, with what can only be described as genuine, existential dread, found that the storm had passed without anyone in the west doing very much to stop it. The Mongols simply left. They would never return in comparable force. It is one of history's more remarkable accidents that the shape of medieval Europe was determined in significant part by the drinking habits of a man in Mongolia whom almost nobody in Europe had ever heard of. The Mongol peace, Pax Mongolica. The period that historians have come to call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, was not peaceful, in any absolute sense. Wars continued at the edges of the empire. Internal tensions between the various khanates simmered. The conquest of the Song dynasty in the south was still ongoing. But for the movement of goods, people, and ideas across the vast middle band of Eurasia, from China to the Black Sea, there was for roughly a century, beginning in the middle of the 1300s, a degree of stability and safety that the trade routes of the ancient world had rarely, if ever, experienced simultaneously across such a distance. Understanding why requires understanding what the Mongol Empire actually guaranteed to those who moved within it. A merchant carrying the Pisa, the tablet of authority issued by the Mongol administration, traveled under the empire's protection across every territory it controlled. Local rulers who interfered with authorized merchants or their goods faced consequences that were enforced consistently enough to make the risk genuinely deterrent. The roads and relay stations of the Yam system, originally built for military communication, were made available to diplomatic and commercial travelers. Fresh horses waited at regular intervals. Caravanserais rest stations with food, shelter, and fodder were maintained along major routes. A journey from the Black Sea ports all the way to China, which would previously have required navigating a patchwork of competing and often hostile political systems, could now be accomplished under a single administrative umbrella for most of its length. The sheer scale of what moved along these routes during the peak of the Pax Mongolica is difficult to convey briefly. Chinese silk and porcelain flowed westward in quantities that transformed consumer culture among the wealthy classes of Persia, the Levant, and eventually Europe. Cotton, textiles, and spices moved from South Asia into the steppe and beyond. Glassware and metalwork from Islamic craftsmen traveled east. Furs from the northern forests moved in multiple directions, but alongside the physical, merchandise moved something harder to weigh and easier to underestimate: techniques, ideas, and knowledge systems that crossed the Eurasian landmass and changed what people knew how to do, on both ends. Paper money, which the Chinese had been using in various forms since the Song dynasty, was encountered by Western travelers in the Mongol domains, with a mixture of fascination and deep suspicion. The concept of handing over a piece of paper in exchange for real goods, and expecting that anyone on the other side of 1,000 miles of steppe would honor it in return, was to a Venetian or Persian merchant accustomed to coins you could bite to test a fairly radical proposition. The technology of printing, which made paper money and written records possible at scale, began moving westward through the networks the Mongol Empire had created, arriving in Europe through multiple intermediary channels over the following century. Gunpowder, which Chinese engineers had been using in military applications for some time, before the Mongol expansion, spread more rapidly into the Islamic world and eventually Europe during this same period. The magnetic compass, which made open ocean navigation more reliable, followed similar channels. None of these transfers happened in a single dramatic moment of cultural exchange. They happened the way most technological diffusion happens, gradually, through a long chain of practical people solving practical problems with the best tools available to them, and not always aware of where those tools had originally come from. The diplomatic missions that European powers sent to the Mongol court during this period provide some of the richest first-hand descriptions of what the empire looked like from the inside. Giovanni Deand del Carpine, a Franciscan friar sent by Pope Innocent IV in 1245, traveled all the way to Karakorum and arrived in time to witness the formal enthronement of Guk Khan, Ögedei's son. His account, written up on his return, described the enormous tent cities that assembled for such occasions. Hundreds of juras spread across the steppe in organized formations, thousands of horses, representatives from dozens of subject peoples, the sheer organizational complexity of an imperial gathering conducted in the open air of the Mongolian plateau. He was not particularly impressed by what he saw as the Mongols' spiritual shortcomings, but he was clearly impressed by the scale and the order. William of Rubric, a Flemish friar sent by King Louis IX of France in 1253, provided an even more detailed account of life at the Mongol court under Mona Khan. His observations covered everything from the specifics of jade construction to the mechanics of kumis fermentation to the complex religious and ethnic diversity of the court itself. He noted that Karakorum contained mosques, Buddhist temples, and a Nestoran Christian church, all within walking distance of each other, and that the court employed craftsmen, advisors, and administrators drawn from China, Persia, Russia, Hungary, and France, among other places. A Parisian goldsmith named Guillaume Boucher had built Mon Kun, an elaborate silver fountain in the shape of a tree, from whose branches flowed wine, arag, mead, and rice beer at the pull of a lever operated by a bellows inside the trunk. It was, depending on your perspective, either a remarkable feat of engineering or compelling evidence that the priorities of powerful men are surprisingly consistent across cultures. One of the most striking events that William of Rub witnessed and described was a formal, religious debate hosted by Mona Khan at Karakorum, in which representatives of Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam were invited to argue the merits of their respective faiths before an audience of Mongol nobles. The debate was organized with rules: no insults, no anger, no claims that could not be defended, and the Mongol audience listened to each side with the kind of attentive neutrality that suggested they found the whole exercise more entertaining than conclusive. Mon Khan himself reportedly watched with genuine interest before retiring to get quietly drunk, which, given the quality of the debate, was perhaps a reasonable response. The fact that this conversation happened at all, that the court of a Central Asian empire in the 1200s was hosting structured interfaith dialogue at a time when most of the surrounding world was conducting its religious disagreements with considerably less civility, is one of the more genuinely surprising details of the Mongol story. The religious tolerance of the Mongol system was not sentimental, it was practical. An empire governing populations of dozens of different faiths could not afford the administrative cost of religious persecution at scale, and the Mongols understood this clearly. Clergy of all recognized religions were exempted from taxation in the early imperial period, partly as a gesture of respect toward the divine powers they served, and partly because taxing religious institutions created resistance that wasn't worth the revenue. Genghis Khan had established the principle, and his successors maintained it with varying degrees of consistency. The result was that Buddhist monasteries in China, mosques in Persia, Orthodox churches in Russia, and Nistaran Christian communities across Central Asia all continued to function under Mongol authority, with a degree of institutional continuity that conquest might easily have destroyed. The movement of people during the Pax Mongolica was not limited to merchants and diplomats. Craftsmen were relocated sometimes voluntarily, sometimes not to wherever the empire needed their skills. A Persian tilemaker might find himself working in China, a Chinese physician might end up treating patients in Tabriz. Scholars moved between courts drawn by patronage and the concentration of resources that major Mongol administrative centers represented. The result was a period of cross-cultural artistic and intellectual production whose traces are visible in Persian manuscript illustration, Chinese ceramic design, and the architectural vocabulary of Central Asian buildings from the period. These were not superficial borrowings. They were genuine fusions produced by people who had spent enough time working across cultural boundaries to internalize multiple traditions simultaneously. The limits of the Pax Mongolica should be acknowledged alongside its achievements. The stability it provided was real for those moving along established routes with proper authorization. It was considerably less real for the farming populations of conquered territories who bore the weight of Mongol taxation and the disruption of agricultural systems that the conquests had caused. The peace of the trade routes coexisted with ongoing violence at the empire's expanding edges and with the structural inequalities of a system built on conquest. It was not in any modern sense a just order. It was an imposed order that had the incidental effect of making certain kinds of long-distance connection possible, and those connections had consequences that outlasted the empire itself by centuries. What the Pax Mongolica ultimately demonstrated was something that the Mongols themselves probably did not articulate in these terms, but enacted through sheer administrative reach, that the Eurasian landmass, for all its geographic and cultural diversity, was not as divided as its political fragmentation made it appear. The people, goods, and ideas that moved through it during this period proved that connection, across the full width of the continent, was not only possible, but productive, in ways that individual isolated regions could not achieve alone. The Mongol Empire created this connection through force, and held it through administrative discipline, but the connections themselves once made had a life of their own. Kublai Khan and the East. Kublai Khan was Genghis Khan's grandson, the fourth son of Toyi, and from early in his life, he showed an orientation toward the settled, literate world of China that set him apart from most of his family. While his cousins and uncles maintained the steppe traditions with varying degrees of conviction, Kublai spent his formative years in close contact with Chinese scholars, administrators, and Buddhist teachers. He learned to read Chinese, an unusual accomplishment for a Mongol prince. He employed Chinese advisors in the management of his personal domains in northern China, and demonstrated an interest in how agricultural civilizations actually functioned from the inside, how they taxed, how they administered justice, how they organized the relationship between a central court and its provincial population. This was not mere curiosity, it was preparation, though for what exactly was not clear, until events made it so. Monk Khan, who had become Great Khan in 1251 after a turbulent succession following Gauk's brief reign, was a capable and energetic ruler who pushed the empire's expansion in multiple directions simultaneously. He sent his brother Hulagu westward to extend Mongol authority into Persia, Iraq, and the Levant. He sent Kublai southward to press the campaign against the southern Song dynasty, the Chinese state below the high river that had survived the destruction of the Jin because the Mongols occupied elsewhere had not yet turned their full attention to it. Then Mon died in 1259 during the Song campaign, probably of dysentery, and everything reorganized itself around the question of who came next. Two brothers emerged as the primary candidates. Kublai directing the Song campaign from his base in northern China, and Erik Bok, the youngest of Towi's sons, who held Karakorum and represented in the eyes of many traditional Mongol leaders the more authentically steppe-rooted vision of what the empire should be. The disagreement between them was not simply personal. It was a genuine argument about the empire's identity, whether it should remain centered on the Mongolian plateau and its nomadic traditions, or whether it should increasingly become something else. Shaped by the civilizations it had absorbed, Erik Bok had the traditional heartland, Kublai had the resources of northern China and the loyalty of commanders who had spent years in the field with him. Kublai moved quickly, holding his own Kerala in northern China, and declaring himself Great Khan before the situation could solidify against him. The civil war that followed lasted 4 years and ended in 1264 when Erik Bok submitted. He was treated with relative mercy. Kublai did not execute him, though Erik Bokhan died not long afterward, possibly from illness, possibly from something less natural. The other Khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, did not all recognize Kublai's authority without reservation, and the unity of the empire was from this point increasingly nominal. But Kublai controlled the east, and the east was where he intended to build something. The conquest of the southern Song dynasty was the longest, most technically demanding, and in many ways most costly campaign the Mongol military ever undertook. The Song had over 60 million subjects, a sophisticated administrative system, and a military that had spent decades specifically adapting to resist Mongol tactics. They also had the Yangtze River and the waterways of southern China, which posed exactly the kind of obstacle that had always given the Mongol army trouble. The Song navy was the most capable in East Asia, and it made direct amphibious assault on many Song positions extremely difficult. The turning point of the campaign was the siege of Xiangyang, a paired fortress city on the Han River that controlled the main invasion route into the Song heartland. The Song defended it with remarkable determination for nearly 5 years, from 1267 to 1272, resupplying the garrison by river under Mongol pressure and holding the position long after any rational calculation suggested it should have fallen. The Mongol commanders ultimately solved the problem by bringing in Muslim engineers from Persia, the same tradition of Islamic military architecture that had built some of the most formidable fortifications in the Western world, who constructed enormous counterweight trebuchets capable of hurling stones with a force and accuracy that the existing Chinese siege equipment could not match. When these machines were deployed against Xiangyang, the effect on the garrison's morale was apparently immediate and decisive. The city fell with the Han River route open. The Mongol advance into Song territory proceeded rapidly. City after city fell to a combination of military pressure and the now well-established Mongol practice of offering clearly defined terms of surrender. Some cities submitted immediately, others resisted and were treated accordingly. The Song court retreated progressively southward, carrying the child emperor with it as the territorial basis of the dynasty collapsed around them. The final act came in 1279 at a naval battle near modern Guangzhou, where the last Song fleet was cornered and destroyed. A loyalist official named Lu Shufu, understanding that capture was the only alternative, took the young emperor, a child of 7, in his arms and jumped into the sea. The southern Song dynasty ended in the water, carrying its last emperor with it. Kublai Khan was now the ruler of all China, the first non-Chinese emperor to achieve this. He established a new dynasty, the Yuan. with its capital at a rebuilt and greatly expanded city on the site of the old Jin capital, which he called Kubalik, meaning City of the Kern. The city that now underlies modern Beijing was laid out on a grand scale, with wide avenues, elaborate palace complexes, markets, and the infrastructure of an imperial capital designed to express the scale and legitimacy of Yuan power. Kublai moved the symbolic center of his empire from the Mongolian steppe to this Chinese city, a decision that traditional Mongol conservatives found troubling, and that the other Khanates took as further evidence that the eastern branch of the family had departed from the original vision. It was into this court, glittering cosmopolitan, and operating on a scale that had no equivalent in the Western world of the time, that Marco Polo arrived, according to his own account, approximately 1275. He had traveled overland from Venice with his father and uncle, merchants who had previously visited the Mongol court and were returning with a letter from the Pope that Kublai had requested. Marco Polo was around 21 years old when he arrived, and he would remain in the Yuan court's orbit for roughly 17 years before returning to Europe. His account of what he saw, dictated to a fellow prisoner after his return and capture during a Venetian-Genoese naval conflict, became one of the most widely read and widely doubted travel narratives in the history of our entrance. The doubts were not entirely unreasonable. Marco Polo described things, paper money accepted as currency across an entire vast empire, a postal relay system that could move messages across thousands of miles in days, cities of a size and population density that dwarfed anything in Europe that sounded to a medieval European audience frankly implausible. He was known informally in Venice for some years after his return as Marco Millions on account of his habit of describing everything in his account in very large numbers. It is worth noting that the large numbers were by and large accurate. The city of Hango, which Polo described as the greatest city in the world, was probably the largest urban area on Earth at the time, with a population that modern historians estimate at somewhere between 1 and 1/2 million people. Numbers that would have made the biggest European cities of the era look like market towns. Kublai himself, as Polo described him, was a man of considerable physical presence, who had grown heavier in his later years, enjoyed hunting, and maintained a court that was simultaneously Chinese in its administrative structure and Mongol in its ceremonial identity. He kept a great hunting park at Xanadu, the Shangdu of the historical record, to which he retreated in summer, a nod to the steppe traditions of his grandfather that sat somewhat incongruously alongside the Confucian administrative apparatus he had built around himself in Kubalik. He was genuinely engaged with questions of governance, genuinely curious about the religions of his empire, and genuinely torn between two cultural identities that pulled in different directions. He resolved this tension by trying to inhabit both simultaneously, with varying degrees of success depending on the audience. His Chinese subjects never fully accepted the Yuan dynasty as legitimate in the deepest cultural sense. The Mongols occupied a separate legal category within their own empire, above the northern Chinese who came next in the hierarchy, above the southern Han Chinese who ranked below them. This structural discrimination generated resentment that accumulated slowly and would eventually contribute to the Yuan dynasty's collapse. But in the peak years of Kublai's reign, the court at Kalka was the most extraordinary convergence of wealth, diversity, and administrative complexity that the medieval world had produced, and it attracted the attention of the world because there was genuinely nothing else quite like it. The limits of empire. The empire that Kublai Khan ruled from Kalka was by any measure an astonishing human achievement. But by the 1200s and 60s and 70s, the Mongol military was beginning to encounter something it had not met often in its first 6 decades of expansion. The specific kinds of terrain, geography, and opposition that its particular strengths were not well designed to handle. The failures that followed did not immediately reverse the empire's trajectory, but they revealed clearly and repeatedly that the military system which had dismantled the Jin dynasty and the Khwarazmian Empire was not a universal solution to every strategic problem on Earth. The clearest demonstration of this came in the campaign against Japan. Kublai Khan had sent diplomatic missions to the Japanese court, demanding submission, and the Japanese, governed by the Kamakura shogunate, under the regent Hojo Tokimune, had declined to impand, which was itself a statement. The first invasion fleet, carrying somewhere around 23,000 soldiers drawn from Mongol, Chinese and Korean forces, landed on the northern coast of Kyushu in 1274. The Japanese defenders fought with considerable determination, and the Mongol force, which had not brought the full weight of its cavalry arm across the water effectively, struggled with the terrain and the resistance it encountered. That night, a significant storm struck the anchored fleet, and the commanders made the decision to withdraw before the situation deteriorated further. The invasion was over. Kublai sent another set of diplomatic demands. The Japanese had the ambassadors executed, which removed any ambiguity about their position. The second invasion fleet, assembled in 1281, was the largest naval expedition the medieval world had attempted. Roughly 4,000 ships, carrying somewhere between 100,000 and 140,000, troops sailing in two coordinated columns that were to converge on Kyushu simultaneously. The coordination largely failed, the landing was contested fiercely, and the combined fleet sat at anchor for weeks in the late summer heat, while the campaign on land went poorly. Then a typhoon swept through the region and destroyed a significant portion of the fleet. Soldiers who survived the sinking of their ships and made it to shore were killed or captured by Japanese forces. The invasion force that had seemed overwhelming became a catastrophe within days. The Japanese called the typhoon kamikaze divine wind, and incorporated the narrative of miraculous deliverance into their national identity in ways that echoed for centuries. The Mongol commanders who survived the return voyage faced a rather less celebratory reception at home. The campaigns in Southeast Asia were a different kind of failure, but a consistent one. The De Viet Kingdom, in what is now northern Vietnam, was invaded 3 times, in 1257, 1284, and 1287. On each occasion, the Mongol force entered the country, encountered a combination of jungle terrain, tropical heat, and disease that degraded its effectiveness rapidly, and faced a Vietnamese military strategy that avoided direct large-scale engagement in favor of hit-and-run harassment, scorched earth withdrawal, and patient waiting for the invaders to weaken themselves. The Vietnamese forces under the Tran dynasty were not capable of defeating the Mongol army in open battle. They did not need to be. They needed only to survive long enough for the climate and logistics to do the work for them, which the climate and logistics obligingly did on all 3 occasions. The third campaign ended with the Mongol forces withdrawing after a significant naval defeat. At the Bac Dang River, where Vietnamese defenders drove sharpened stakes into the riverbed at low tide and lured the Mongol fleet in at high water. The ships were impaled when the tide fell. It was tactically inventive and thoroughly effective. The Java expedition of 1292 was in its own way the most instructive failure of all. Kublai had demanded that the king of a Japanese state, called Singasari, submit and accept Mongol authority. The king had responded by having the Mongol envoys branded on their faces, a humiliation that Kublai could not ignore politically. He dispatched a substantial fleet which arrived to find that Singasari had already been overthrown by a rival Japanese ruler. A prince of the old Singasari line, named Raiden Wijaya, then approached the Mongol commanders with a proposition. He would submit to Mongol authority and guide them against his own enemy, who had just destroyed his kingdom. The Mongol commanders accepted this arrangement, helped Raiden Wijaya defeat his rival, and found themselves deep in Japanese territory with a newly empowered local ally who, now that his enemy was gone, had no remaining reason to cooperate with them. Raiden turned on the Mongol force, inflicted significant losses in the jungle terrain where Mongol cavalry was useless, and chased the expedition back to its ships. The fleet returned to China, having spent considerable resources to help a Japanese prince consolidate his power and found a new kingdom. The new kingdom Majapahit would go on to become one of the most significant states in Southeast Asian history. Kublai's treasury received nothing. While these eastern and southern failures were accumulating, the western branch of the empire had already encountered its own decisive check. The Ilkhanate, the Mongol Khanate, ruling Persia and Iraq under Hulagu, Kublai's brother, had pushed into the Levant in 1258, sacking Baghdad and killing the Abbasid Caliph, in an act that sent a profound shock through the Islamic world. The Caliph was the symbolic head of Sunni Islam, and his death reportedly wrapped in a carpet and trampled by horses. In the Mongol tradition of avoiding the spilling of royal blood, represented the end of an institution that had existed for over 500 years. The Mongol advance continued into Syria, taking Aleppo and Damascus, and appeared to be heading toward Egypt. Egypt was governed by the Mamluks, a sultanate built on a military caste of former slave soldiers, predominantly of Turkic origin, who had seized power from their previous rulers and built a state organized around military excellence. Their sultan at this period was a man named Babars, one of the more capable commanders of the former medieval world, who had spent his career fighting both Crusaders and now Mongols, and who understood both opponents with a tactical clarity born of experience. When the Mongol force under a commander named Kitbuka entered Palestine in 1260, Babars moved to meet it. The Battle of Angelot, fought near the Springs of Goliath in September of 1260, was not the largest battle of the Mongol period. The Mongol force engaged was not the main Ilkhanate army. Hulagu had pulled most of his troops back to deal with succession politics following Mon Khan's death, and what remained in the Levant was a detachment, though a significant one. But the outcome was definitive. The Mamluks defeated the Mongol force at Angelot, and Kitbuka was captured and killed. The Mongols withdrew from Palestine and never successfully returned. Babars pursued his advantage aggressively, recovering Syria and establishing a frontier that the Ilkhanate, for all its subsequent campaigns, could not push through permanently. Ain Jalalut mattered beyond its immediate military outcome, because it was the first time a tough Mongol army in the field had been defeated, and not simply inconvenienced. The psychological effect of Mongol invincibility, the reputation that had caused city gates to open before the army arrived, that had driven Shah Muhammad to flee rather than fight, that had paralyzed European military thinking in 1241, was not destroyed by a Jalut, but it was cracked. The Mamluks had demonstrated that the Mongol army could be read, anticipated, and beaten by a force that was well organized, well led, and adapted to the specific tactical situation. What all of these failures shared was a common thread. The Mongol military system had been optimized for conditions that prevailed across the Eurasian steppe and the broad agricultural plains adjacent to it. Open ground, room for cavalry maneuver, supply lines that could be maintained by living off the land. These were the conditions under which the system worked with devastating effectiveness. Remove those conditions, add deep jungle, wide ocean, tropical disease, or a determined opponent who understood the feigned retreat and refused to chase, and the system's advantages diminished or disappeared entirely. The empire had reached the edges of the geography that had made it possible. Beyond those edges lay the ocean, the jungle, and the desert, and none of them were places where a Mongol army on horseback was genuinely at home. These limits did not collapse the empire, but they established its shape, roughly the shape it would hold, until internal fracture did what external opposition had largely failed to do. Division, plague, and fracture. The Mongol Empire was never in truth a single unified state, in the way that the Roman Empire or the Tang dynasty of China had been. It was always at its core a family enterprise, a collection of territories governed by different branches of Genghis Khan's descendants, held together by shared identity, the authority of the Great Khan, and a set of political norms that required periodic reaffirmation to remain functional. When those norms held and the branches cooperated, the empire operated with remarkable coherence across enormous distances. When they broke down, as they increasingly did after Mon Khan's death in 1259, the underlying fragility of the arrangement became visible. By the 1260s, the empire had effectively divided into 4 separate political entities that shared a common origin, but increasingly pursued their own interests. Kublai's Yuan dynasty controlled China and nominal authority over the whole, though that nominal authority was contested. The Golden Horde descended from Jokei line, and led in this period by Börte Khan, controlled the Russian steppe, the Caucasus region, and the western approaches to Central Asia. The Subutai Khanate, descended from Genghis Khan's second son, occupied the middle band of Central Asia, and the Ilkhanate, founded by Hulagu, and his descendants governed Persia, Iraq, and the surrounding regions. These were not friendly neighbors. The Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate were in active military conflict over the Caucasus territories. The Subutai Khanate was a source of instability that troubled both its neighbors, and a significant portion of Kublai's later decades was consumed by his conflict with Kaidu Khan, a grandson of Ögedei, who refused to recognize Kublai's legitimacy and maintained an independent power base in Central Asia that Kublai never managed to eliminate despite decades of effort and multiple campaigns. The internal wars between the Khanates were not merely political disagreements resolved through diplomatic correspondence. They involved real armies fighting real battles across the territories of the empire's former subjects, disrupting the trade routes and administrative systems that the Pax Mongolica had taken decades to build. The coherence that had made the Silk Road functional under unified Mongol authority began to degrade as the political guarantors of that coherence turned their attention and resources toward fighting each other. Kublai Khan's personal trajectory in his final decades reflected the larger pattern of imperial strain. He had lost his favorite wife, Chabi, in 1281, a loss that those around him noted visibly affected his judgment and his disposition. He lost a son he had been grooming as his heir not long after. He grew increasingly heavy, suffered from gout severe enough to limit his movement, and turned to alcohol in quantities that alarmed his physicians in the same way Ögedei's drinking had alarmed the physicians of the previous generation. The campaigns against Japan, Vietnam, and Java had consumed enormous resources and produced nothing. Kaidu's challenge in Central Asia showed no sign of resolution. By the time Kublai died in 1294, the confident expansionism of his middle years had given way to a court-managing decline rather than directing growth. The Yuan dynasty, under his successors, entered a period of remarkable political instability. Between 1294 and 1333, a span of less than 40 years, the Yuan throne changed hands roughly 10 times. Emperors came and went through a combination of natural death, assassination, and factional maneuvering at a pace that made coherent governance increasingly difficult. The Mongol ruling class in China remained administratively separate from the Chinese population beneath them, maintaining the hierarchical distinction that Kublai had built into the Yuan system, which meant that as the dynasty weakened, there was no reservoir of Chinese political loyalty to draw upon. The Mongols had always been conquerors in China, not rulers in the deeper cultural sense. And when the dynasty's competence faltered, the relationship between the governing class and the governed population had no genuine foundation of shared identity to fall back on. The Ilkhanate followed a different arc, but arrived at a similar endpoint. Under Genghis Khan, who came to power in 1295, the Ilkhanate converted to Islam, a decision that was partly personal conviction and partly political calculation. Since ruling a population that was overwhelmingly Muslim, while maintaining a non-Muslim court had created persistent legitimacy problems. Ghazan was a capable ruler who introduced administrative reforms and supported cultural production, and the Ilkhat under him experienced a genuine period of recovery and relative stability. But the Khanate institutional foundations were not deep enough to survive beyond a few generations of competent leadership. After Ghazan's brother Abu Said, who died in 1335 without a clear heir, the Ilkhanate fragmented into competing successor states within a decade. The unified political authority the Mongols had imposed on Persia and Iraq dissolved back into the regional complexity that had existed before Hulagu's campaign. And then came the plague. The disease that Europeans would call the Black Death appears to have originated somewhere in the Central Asian steppe environment, possibly in the region around the northern shore of the Caspian Sea, in the 1330s. The Mongol trade routes that had done so much to connect Eurasia commercially also provided exactly the infrastructure that a contagious disease needed to move efficiently across vast distances, regular movement of people and goods along established corridors, relay stations where travelers stopped and interacted, and a network dense enough to carry infection from its point of origin to both ends of the continent within a relatively short period. The disease reached the Black Sea port of Kaffa, a Genoese trading colony on the Crimean coast in 1346, when a Golden Horde army under Yan Ken was besieging the city. The army was itself suffering severely from the plague, and according to a Genoese account written not long after, the Mongol commanders made the decision to catapult the bodies of their dead over the city walls, apparently hoping the resulting disease would accelerate the city's surrender. The Genoese threw the bodies into the sea as quickly as they could. It did not help. The infection had already entered the city, and when Genoese merchant ships fled Kaffa and sailed west, they carried the disease with them to Constantinople, to Sicily, and then into the heart of Europe. Europe lost somewhere between a third and half of its population over the following decade. The Islamic world was similarly devastated. China, which had experienced earlier outbreaks of what may have been the same disease during the Mongol period, also suffered enormous losses. The demographic catastrophe of the Black Death reshaped the economies, social structures, and political systems of every civilization it touched. Labor became scarce, which shifted power toward working people in ways that had not existed before. Agricultural systems were disrupted by the simple absence of the people needed to work them. Religious institutions struggled to explain immortality that struck the devout and the impious with equal indifference. The social fabric of European, Islamic, and Chinese civilization was pulled apart and rewoven differently in the decades that followed. The Mongol trade network had not created the plague. It had always been somewhere in the rodent populations of the Central Asian steppe, but the network had given it a highway, and the highway had connected every major civilization in Eurasia to the same catastrophe simultaneously. In China, the combination of plague, flooding, famine, and the accumulated resentments of Yuan misrule produced the conditions for large-scale rebellion in the 1350s and 60s. The Red Turban movement, which drew on a combination of Buddhist millenarianism and genuine popular grievance, spread through the Yangtze River Valley and provided the organizational framework around which a broader anti-UN coalition eventually formed. From within this movement emerged a man named Zhu Yuanzhang, the orphaned son of a tenant farmer, who had survived the plague and famine of the 1340s by begging and spending time in a Buddhist monastery, who proved to be one of the most capable military and political organizers of the period. He built a coalition, defeated his rivals within the rebel movement, and turned his combined force against the Yuan court in the north. The last Yuan emperor, Togon Timur, fled Beijing in 1368 as Zhu Yuanzhang's forces approached, not in a final dramatic last stand, but in a pragmatic withdrawal northward toward Mongolia, which was where the Mongols had come from, and where a remnant court and military structure would persist for some time as the northern Yuan. The Yuan dynasty was over. The Ming dynasty, one of the most stable and longest-lasting in Chinese history, began. Founded by the farmer's son, who had survived everything the late Mongol period had inflicted on the Chinese countryside, the Mongols had ruled China for roughly a century. They left behind them a country that was deeply scarred by the plague, by the agricultural disruptions of the conquest period, and by decades of political instability under weak Yuan successors. They also left behind an administrative infrastructure, trade connections, and a degree of Eurasian integration that would shape Chinese foreign policy and economic geography for generations. The Ming would go on to send the great treasure fleets of Admiral Genghis across the Indian Ocean, voyages made possible by the shipbuilding traditions and geographic knowledge that the Yuan period had accumulated. The Mongols were gone from China, But what they had built did not disappear cleanly when they left. What the storm left behind, the Mongol Empire did not end cleanly. It did not fall in a single dramatic moment, or dissolve in a defined political act. It faded khanate by khanate across the course of a century and a half, with different regions, detaching at different speeds, and leaving behind different kinds of residue. Understanding what the empire left in the world requires looking at several different layers of consequence: political, demographic, cultural, technological, and genetic, because the Mongol impact was not uniform across the territories it touched, and the legacy it produced was not simple. The Golden Horde, the westernmost of the four khanates, lasted longer than most. It continued exercising authority over the Russian principalities until the 1400s, collecting tribute and maintaining the political dominance that the campaigns of 1237–40 had established. The Russian princes who sought patents of authority, the Yalik, from the Horde's court, were participating in a relationship of subordination that shaped Russian political culture in the ways historians still debate. Some scholars have argued that the Mongol period embedded a particular model of centralized, autocratic authority into Russian political practice that outlasted the Horde itself. Others see this connection as overstated. What is not debated is that the Mongol period restructured the balance of power among the Russian principalities, contributing to the eventual rise of Moscow over its rivals, partly because Moscow's princes proved adept at managing their relationship with the Horde, and partly because the Horde's patronage gave them resources their neighbors lacked. The Golden Horde itself fragmented through the 1400s into a series of successor khanates: the Kazan Khanate, the Astrakhan Khanate, the Crimean Khanate, which were progressively absorbed by the expanding Russian state over the following 2 centuries. The Crimean Khanate survived longest under Ottoman protection until its annexation by Catherine the Great of Russia in 1783. The last direct institutional descendant of the Golden Horde disappeared from the map 600 years after the first Mongol armies had crossed the Volga. The Mongol legacy in Central Asia took a different form, channeled through the extraordinary figure of Timur, known in the Western world as Tamerlane, who rose to power in the Chagatai Khanate, former territories in the second half of the 1400s. Timur was not himself a Chinggisid. He was not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, but he governed through a puppet, Chinggisid, and styled himself as the restorer of Mongol imperial greatness. His campaigns were conducted with a deliberate invocation of Mongol methods, including the towers of skulls that became his particular signature, and his military achievements were genuinely enormous. He defeated the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I, dismantled the Delhi Sultanate, and reorganized Central Asia under his authority, from his capital at Samarkand. His empire did not hold together past his death in 145, but his dynasty produced the Timurid Renaissance, a remarkable flowering of Persian literature, architecture, and miniature painting. And one of his descendants, a prince named Baba, who had been pushed out of Central Asia by Usuzbek rivals, took his remaining forces into the Indian subcontinent and founded the Mughal Empire in 1526. The Mughal Empire governed much of South Asia for over 3 centuries. Its rulers were simultaneously descendants of Timur, and through Timur's Chinggisid wives, descendants of Genghis Khan. The Taj Mahal, built by the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan in the 1640s as a tomb for his wife, is in this sense at a very long remove part of the Mongol story. The bloodline that began with a boy born in a felt tent on the Mongolian steppe reached through a chain of conquest and inheritance spanning 4 centuries to the white marble of Agra. History makes strange connections when given enough time. The technological transfers of the Mongol period were among the most consequential and least visually dramatic of its legacies. The movement of printing technology westward from China through the networks the Mongol Empire had created contributed to the conditions that eventually made Gutenberg press possible in the 1450s. Not directly, not through a single chain of transmission, but as part of a broader diffusion of knowledge and technique across the Eurasian landmass that the Mongol period had accelerated. Gunpowder moved similarly, arriving in Europe in forms that within 2 centuries would make the armored knight obsolete and reshape the entire military and political structure of European civilization. The compass improved oceanic navigation, paper monies, conceptual footprint reached Western banking systems through intermediary channels. None of these transfers happened because the Mongols sat down and planned a technology exchange program. They happened because the empire created movement, and movement carried knowledge. The borders of modern Central Asia, the rough outlines of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan reflect at considerable remove the administrative divisions the Mongol Khanates imposed on the region. The political geography that Soviet Kazakhs formalized in the 20th century drew on patterns of settlement and regional identity that had been shaped partly by Mongol administrative boundaries 7 centuries earlier. History's influence on geography rarely announces itself directly, but it leaves its fingerprints in the way territories are named, claimed, and divided long after the original causes have been forgotten. The genetic legacy of the Mongol Empire was documented in a study published in 2003, which found that roughly 8% of the men living in the broad region of the former Mongol Empire, approximately 16 million people, share a particular Y chromosome pattern that appears to have originated in a single individual living roughly 1,000 years ago in Mongolia. The pattern's distribution maps closely onto the territories the Mongols controlled, with concentrations particularly high in Central Asia. The most likely candidate for the original carrier of this genetic pattern is Genghis Khan himself or a close male relative. The Mongol practice of absorbing large numbers of women from conquered peoples into the households of Chinggisid men, a practice that extended across multiple generations of rulers and commanders, produced a demographic impact that is still measurable in the human genome. Genghis Khan built the largest empire in history, and may also, by one measure, be the most biologically influential single human being who ever lived. Both facts are real, and together, they produce a portrait of a life whose scale is almost impossible to hold in mind simultaneously. The memory of the Mongols varies enormously depending on where you are standing when you encounter it. In Mongolia, Genghis Khan is the founding national hero. His face appears on currency, his name on airports and vodka brands, and government buildings, and the national narrative of the country is built substantially around his achievement. The complex moral weight of what he actually did has been folded into a pride of cultural origin that is genuinely felt and politically important in a country that spent most of the 20th century as a Soviet satellite and has spent the post-Soviet period rebuilding a distinct national identity in Iran, Iraq, and parts of Central Asia. The Mongol conquest is remembered as a catastrophe, the destruction of cities, the collapse of agricultural systems, the deaths of tens of millions of people, and the memory is not heroic. In China, the Mongol period occupies a complicated space in the national historical narrative, acknowledged as a dynastic era, but not particularly celebrated. In Russia, the Mongol period, sometimes called the Tatar yoke, has served for centuries as a cultural reference point for external oppression and interrupted development, real and imagined. All of these memories contain genuine truth and genuine distortion in proportions that shift depending on which community is doing the remembering and for what purpose. The Mongol Empire was simultaneously the instrument of some of the most severe demographic catastrophes in pre-Odan history, and the creator of the most extensive connected trade and communication network the ancient and medieval world had ever produced. It destroyed cities and preserved others. It killed scholars and employed them. It spread the Black Death along its trade routes, and spread printing technology along the same routes. The moral balance sheet does not resolve cleanly, and the historians who have tried to make it resolve, either by emphasizing the destruction or by emphasizing the connectivity, have generally had to leave something important out to make their argument work. What the Mongol Empire ultimately demonstrates above everything else is the scale of what a single human life can set in motion when it operates at the intersection of personal capacity, historical circumstance, and the willingness to remake the world's assumptions about what is possible. A boy born in a felt tent on the Mongolian steppe, abandoned by his clan, forced to survive on fish and marmots, imprisoned in a wooden collar, that boy built something that connected China to Europe, that moved technology and disease, and trade and ideas across the width of the Eurasian continent, that shaped the borders and fish political cultures and genetic makeup of populations numbering in the hundreds of millions. The storm that was the Mongol Empire passed, but the landscape it moved through was never quite the same shape again. And that, in the long run, is what history mostly is: not the great events themselves, but the changed world they leave behind, still carrying the marks of the wind, long after the wind has gone. If you are still awake at this point, and it would be entirely understandable if you are not, there is another story waiting for you on the screen right now, ready to carry you a little further into the past. If this one brought you something, a like or a subscribe or a thought left in the comments below would mean more than you know. But for now, let your body go heavy, let the steppe grass settle. The horses have stopped. The great Khan has returned to the earth. There is nothing left tonight but the quiet. Close your eyes, rest well. Before you close tonight, drop your current city or country in the comments below, along with your local time. Whether you are watching from Afghanistan itself, or from anywhere that this story has reached, tell us where you are. We read every single comment. If tonight's journey through the complete history of Mongol dynasty gave you something anew, understanding, please hit the like button and subscribe to Legacy of Throne. Your support makes it possible for us to keep bringing these deep, detailed histories to audiences around the world. There is much more history coming to this channel, and you will not want to miss it. We will see you on the next journey.